said, giving the teen a reassuring smile. You've lived a rough life, there's no denying it, but things aren't going to get easier. The North is cold, hard, and unforgiving, and the Night's Watch is the same. If you want to make your life any easier here, you have to put aside the fear of your father and put in the effort at swordplay. He held up a hand to stop Sam's protest. No one's saying you have to be Sabaristan the Bold, but anything is better than what you've been doing. I don't know if I can. You have no choice. Remember that most of the men who join the Watch are criminals, thieves and poachers, murderers and rapists. I won't be here forever, Sam. John's message was clear. Sam was overweight, couldn't defend himself, and was quick to tears. While John was around, the other recruits left him relatively alone, and all Sam had to worry about was the biting tongue of Sir Alisa. Once John left for Winterfell, Sam would be on his own again, and no doubt the other recruits would bully him, as most teens around Sam's age tended to do. And with a lot of them being low-born criminals rather than the sons of noble lords, well, one can only imagine how much worse the bullying would be. Sam shuddered. Okay, I'll try my best. Good, John muttered. Now pick up your sword, and let's try this again. 2 days later at dinner, Tyrion informed John that they would be departing after the morning meal. The Lannister was getting tired of the cold, and the men that had accompanied him were sick of it as well. While John had been making friends with, and training, some of the recruits, Tyrion had spent most of his time reading the books in the Castle Black Library, talking with the blind maester, and sharing a cup of wine with the Lord Commander. I'll be sad to see you leave, Lannister, the old bear grunted. I bet you never thought to say such a thing, Tyrion teased with his trademark smirk. Lord Commander Mormont chuckled. No, I never did. You're a smart man. The Watch could use a man like you. It was Tyrion's turn to chuckle. I'm afraid there's not enough wine in the world to keep me this far north any longer. John took the opportunity to move from the high table down to the rows of tables where the brothers of the Night's Watch sat. He found Grenn, Halder, and Piper sitting with each other. Where's Sam? John asked, as he sat down with them. Don't know, Grenn answered with a shrug. Outside of training in the morning, the other three rarely spent time around Sam, and the times they did spend with him were because of John. It was clear they didn't want to make any outreach of friendship. I'll be leaving for home on the morrow. You're leaving us already? PYP asked with a frown. You should stay and join the Watch, Halder said. You'd be a ranger for sure, and you're already a better trainer than Thorne. John shook his head and sighed. I wanted to join, but my father has forbidden it for now. Maybe in a few years, who knows what the future holds. We'll be sad to see you go. I'll come back, John promised. Within the year I'll visit again, and I'll bring the finest wine in Winterfell to toast the newest brothers of the Night's Watch. You better, Grenn said. You can't promise a man wine and then not deliver. I will. I do have a favor to ask of you all before I leave though. He's leaving, and thinks he can ask a favor. The nerve. PYP said, laughter in his voice. John smiled, but his eyes were solemn. Befriend Sam and keep an eye on him. You're asking too much, Snow. We'll be the laughing stock of the Watch with him. No one could make fun of you, Grenn, you're too dumb to understand the insults. PYP was forced to duck Grenn's attempt to hit him upside the head. The smaller teen came up grinning, and stuck his tongue out. Do it as a favor to me and I'll bring more than just wine when I come back. I'll bring you cloaks, like the one my uncle wears, and boots, proper boots meant for northern winters. John watched as the three shared a look between them. It was finery none of them ever had access to in their lives, warm boots to keep their feet dry in the snow and a warm cloak to wrap around them when the weather got colder. Halder shrugged his shoulders. All right, Snow, we'll keep an eye on Sam for you. With the promise secured, and assuring them he would get their foot sizes in the morning before he departed, John set out to find Sam. He knew the teen often ate his dinner elsewhere in order to avoid the teasing of the other recruits. He just didn't know where he ate instead. Ghost was waiting for him outside of the common hall where the brothers ate. John gave the direwolf a large piece of the meat they had for dinner, which was unidentified but tasted like elk. He didn't think it would be enough for the growing direwolf, but it was the best he could do at the moment. John thought the most likely place to find Sam would be the library, but the teen was not there. He tried looking for him in his room but he was not there either. He glanced briefly up at the wall but shook his head. Sam had many fears, and heights was one of them. He'd never willingly travel to the top of the wall and no one in the watch would give the lad guard duty up there, not yet at least. "Do you know where Sam is?" John asked, looking at Ghost. Ghost looked at him for a moment before he started trotting off to the stout wooden keep that stood beneath the rookery, where John had previously been to check the library. John knew that outside of Holding Castle Black's library, the keep was where the infirmary was and where the Maester and his personal stewards lived. John hoped the visit to the Maester was not health-related. He had not had much interaction with Maester Eamon but it made sense to him that Sam would seek safety within his halls. With Ghost leading, and John opening the doors, they were able to find Sam in Master Eamon's rooms, the door open. The main room was filled with books and scrolls of parchment, and various vials and bottles with tiny labels. There was a desk stacked with blank parchment, inkwells and quills, and a cot off to the side. Through a doorway John glimpsed a small bedroom that had furs hanging from the walls, as a way to keep out the cold was John's guess. Maester Eamon sat in a chair near the fire and Sam sat across from him. They were in the middle of a conversation that John was interrupting. He was unsure if either knew they were missing dinner. "Sorry to disturb you, Maester Eamon, I was just looking for Sam here." "No worries, Jon Snow," the blind man said as he waved John into the room. "Tyrion Lannister told me you are leaving tomorrow." Not for the first time, John marveled at Maester Eamon's ability to recognize someone without issue just by the sound of their voice. He entered fully into the room, Ghost padding along at his side. "Yes, we are set to leave in the morning." "That's the reason I was looking for you, Sam, to let you know." Sam's face fell and his lower lip quivered, but he didn't shed any tears. Jon Snow was grateful. It meant that some progress was being made. "You can stick with Gren and Halder and PYP. They're good people. They'll help you should you have need." Sam's face said he didn't agree with what John said but he nodded his head all the same. "I'm sorry to see you go," Sam said. He stood from his chair, his girth pushing it back, the room filling with the sound of wood scraping against stone. "If you'll excuse me, I have things I need to do." Sam left before either John or Maester Eamon could say anything. John sighed. "He has told me what you have been doing for him," Master Eamon said to John. "You did all you could." "All I could wasn't enough," John lamented. "I'm unsure how long the others you mention will be able to keep an eye on young Sam well. We received a letter from one of our wandering crows, Gunn. He is leaving the Westerlands with 4 new recruits. It will take a few months before they get here but once they are close, Sir Alisa will pass on several of the recruits to the Lord Commander." John knew that Gren and PYP were 2 of the best swordsmen out of the recruits, thanks in part to John's help. If any of the recruits were going to become sworn brothers of the Night's Watch first, it would be those 2. And Halder had been at the wall longer than most of the other recruits, so it would make sense that he would advance as well. There was no way Thorn would let Sam advance, especially in 2 months. Sam would be lucky if he becomes a sworn brother within the year. "Maester Eamon, you can have Sam taken from training and made a brother of the Night's Watch. Our Lord Commander has given training of recruits into the hands of Sir Alisa," the Maester said gently. "Only he may say when a boy is ready to swear his vow, as you surely know." "The Lord Commander listens to you," John told the Maester, as he moved to, and sat in, the chair Sam had abandoned. Ghost moved with him, and sat at his side. John absent-mindedly scratched behind the direwolf's ear. "Without us to keep him safe, Sam will have no chance. He's hopeless with a sword. My sister Arya could tear him apart and she's only 10. The Night's Watch is a hard place, Jon Snow. Sam would not be the first recruit to train for years before he becomes a brother." John took a deep breath to gather his thoughts. "I remember once I asked Maester Lewin why he wore a chain around his throat." Maester Eamon touched his own collar lightly, his bony, wrinkly finger stoking the heavy metal link. "Go on." "He told me a Maester's collar is made of a chain to remind him that he is sworn to serve," John said, remembering. "I asked him why each link was a different metal. 'A silver chain would look much finer with his grey robes,' I said." Master Lewin laughed. "A Maester forges his chain with study, he told me. The different metals are each a different kind of learning, gold for the study of money and accounts, silver for healing, iron for warcraft. And he said there were other meanings as well. The collar is supposed to remind the Maester of the realm he serves, isn't that so? Lords are gold and knights are steel, but two links can't make a chain. You also need silver and iron and lead, tin and copper and bronze and all the rest, and those are farmers and smiths and merchants and the like. A chain needs all sorts of metals, and a land needs all sorts of people. Maester Eamon smiled. And so? The Night's Watch needs all sorts too. Why else have rangers and stewards and builders? Lord Randall couldn't make Sam a warrior, and Sir Alisa won't either. You can't hammer tin into iron, no matter how hard you beat it, but that doesn't mean that tin is useless. Why shouldn't Sam be a steward? The Order of Stewards keeps the Watch alive. They hunt and farm, tend the horses, milk the cows, gather firewood, and cook the meals. You have seen Sam in ways that I cannot. Is he a hunter? He hates hunting, Jon admitted. Can he plough a field? The Maester asked. Can he drive a wagon or sail a ship? Could he butcher a cow? No, but I know one thing Sam could do better than anyone. Yes. Maester Eamon prompted. He could help you. Jon had seen the two stewards who helped Eamon. One was 60 if he was a day, an old man. He only seemed young compared with Eamon. Short and round, the man was already half blind. The other was a surly man in his early 20s with a red face filled with boils. Being low-born he couldn't read or write, and he had no education to speak of. Jon had been able to pick that up after hearing the young man talk no more than 5 words. Sam's smart, Jon continued, as I'm sure you've learned in your conversations with him. He can do sums, and he knows how to read and write. I know one of your stewards is starting to go blind, and the other can't read. Sam would be good with the ravens too. Animals seem to like him. Ghost took to him straight off. There's a lot he could do besides fighting. The Night's Watch needs every man. Make use of him. Maester Eamon closed his eyes, and for a brief moment Jon was afraid that he had gone to sleep. Finally he said, Maester Lewin has taught you well, Jon Snow. Your mind is as deft as your blade, it would seem. Does that mean? It means I shall think on what you have said, the Maester said firmly. It is still 2 months until Gon reaches Castle Black. In the meantime, you would do best to encourage Sam to do everything he can between now and then to help his case. The younger of the two helpers, the one with the boils on his face, entered the room with a plate of food. He stopped at the sight of Jon sitting there, before clearing his throat. Maester Eamon, I saw you weren't at dinner, so I got you some food. Thank you, Chet. Jon stood and Ghost stood with him. Thank you for listening to me, Maester Eamon. I'll take my leave so you can eat. Come, Ghost. Together, he and his direwolf found themselves outside again. The sun, which had begun to set when dinner had started, had set completely and the stars glittered overhead. A few torches had been lit, their orange glow illuminating the buildings. There you are. Jon saw a giant shadow approaching him. He turned to see Tyrion Lannister making his way from the King's Tower, where honored guests of the Night's Watch, such as themselves, slept. I've been looking for you. Me? Jon asked, raising an eyebrow. Do you remember why I wanted to come to the wall? Tyrion asked. Jon thought about it for a moment, before he recalled a conversation had several nights ago. You want to piss off the wall? Tyrion gave a drunken grin. Since it is our last night here, I thought, what better time to do it than now? Will you accompany me? Jon looked up at the wall and found himself unable to see the top. He had gone up there once, on his second day being at Castle Black. He had gone up with his uncle, and it was where his uncle told him that he would be leaving on a ranging north. The view had been breathtaking, hundreds of miles of trees covered in snow and stretching out past what his eyes could see. He wondered if the view would hold the same beauty under the light of the moon. He then looked back at Tyrion, who was drunk even if he appeared steady on his feet. The smell of wine was slowly wafting its way up to Jon's nose and the man held no bottles in his hands. The last thing he wanted was his friend to stumble off the wall to his death, though it was hard to imagine himself holding the back of Tyrion's breeches while the dwarf took a piss off a 700-foot-tall wall of ice. We'll join you. Excellent. Tyrion gestured to the wall itself. John didn't think Tyrion meant to ascend the great switchback stairs that climbed all the way to the top. Even during the day the climb was treacherous, and that was not even taking into account Tyrion's stature. That left the iron cage and winch as the only way to get up, and that could only be brought up by those already on the wall. "How do you plan on getting the cage up there?" John asked. "I paid off the crows who would be manning the top of the wall for the first night shift," Tyrion answered as he pulled open the cage door. John should have known Tyrion would have already thought of the obstacle and a way around it. With a shake of his head, John stepped into the cage and was quickly joined by Ghost and Tyrion. Soon they were on their way up, climbing the 700 feet to piss off the top of the wall. Chapter 10, Ned 4. Ned 4. If there was a time in his life where he had been busier than his first few weeks in King's Landing, then Ned could not recall it. His first order of business had been limiting the royal family's budget, much to the dismay of Cersei and Renly, who found he no longer had access to it for all the clothes he purchased. That had been why he needed Robert at the very next council meeting, to make sure it was heard coming from the king himself, because while he thought Renly would likely respect Ned's authority, he knew Cersei would not. She had argued with Robert, but the king had put his foot down, and for that Ned was grateful. With the help of Veon Poole, he pored over the various books provided by Baelish that went over the Seven Kingdoms' financial information. The records went back a few years and he was able to see everything the realm spent even a halfpenny on. Baelish was meticulous in his record keeping, and nothing seemed out of place to Ned or Veon. The one thing it showed was that even without all the tourneys and feast held, it would take a century to pay back all the debts owed. Robert's great-great-grandchildren would still be paying off the debt. To help speed up the repayment process, Ned had increased the tax on all imports from Essos by 2%. For singular purchases, it didn't amount to much, but for those who bought in bulk it could add up. He also increased the tax on the sale of alcohol by an extra silver stag per barrel of wine or ale sold. He knew such increases would not make him a popular man amongst the common folk, but there was an overwhelming debt he needed to start paying off. He told Baelish that at least half of the money from these new taxes, which would amount to thousands of extra gold dragons a month, should be used to set up monthly payments to help pay off the debt of the realm, starting with that owed to the Iron Bank. It was true that they owed more to Tywin Lannister, but as long as Tywin's grandson was to be heir, Ned doubted interest would be added to that sum. The Iron Bank on the other hand had toppled city-states and kingdoms when payments weren't made. He wouldn't let Robert be their next target. He wrote a letter to Stannis asking the reason for his leave of King's Landing and his duty to the realm as the master of ships. He stated in the letter that they would either need a suitable excuse or Stannis would have to return to the city. Otherwise, they would have no choice but to replace him on the council. He had Robert sign his name below his own, since it was both Robert's council and his own brother. He looked into possible replacements while he waited to see if Stannis would respond. Ned had taken to sending some of his men into the city, in plain clothes so as not to be identified as being with the Hand, to gather information. He wanted to hear what the people had to say, for potential problems that plagued the common folk that he wouldn't hear of as a lord. A disturbing thing he kept hearing about was the corruption of the gold cloaks, whether it be extortion, bribery, assault, rape, or any number of other crimes. He had asked Varley, one of the members of his guard, to discreetly look into it further, to get names of all those who committed these criminal acts, especially those in charge, and to build a case against them that he could use to deliver justice. He wondered if the corruption of the gold cloaks was a recent thing, or something that had existed since the inception of the order. Next he made an offer to the people of King's Landing, either 10 silver stags, a gold dragon, and 5 acres of land, or 10 silver stags, a plot of land less than a quarter of an acre, and 6 gold dragons, to any family who left the city to settle in the land around Moat Cailin. The silver stags would be paid before they left, so they could afford the journey, and the other 2 would be given to them when they arrived. The 5 acres of land would come with an already built hovel, and the gold dragon was to purchase supplies when they arrived, like tools to till the land and crops to grow, or materials to build a pen, and livestock such as chickens and goats to fill it. The second offer was to encourage those to come and build businesses like bakeries, cobblers, tailors, and the like. This would all come out of the Winterfell coffers, and Ned would give them the silver stags from his personal money pouch. 87 families, almost 370 people in total, mostly the poorest of the poor from places like Flea Bottom, accepted the offer, draining the personal money he brought with him to King's Landing considerably, but he knew he would be receiving a monthly sum for his duties as hand, though he would only accept half of the normal amount, so he wasn't too concerned. Most of those going took the option with more land, but those who had some experience at a trade took the extra money instead. He wrote a letter to Steward Tallheart explaining the situation and advised him to have surveyors start divvying up the land and hiring builders to build the hovels. He wrote another letter to Rob to go to the Winterfell vault and gather the money owed to the families and to Steward Tallheart for the builders, and to send it to Moat Cailin. The number of people accepting the move north was fewer than he had hoped. Too many were afraid of what they believed they would find in the north, a never-ending winter and a savage people, the same the people of the north believed they would find if they ever adventured beyond the wall. King's Landing was still overpopulated, and he needed to find more ways to mitigate the issue before a plague befell all those who lived within the walls. "I could be hunting," Robert groaned as he sat at the head of the small council table. "You could be," Ned agreed. Robert and Ned were the only two in the room, as it wasn't an official meeting of the small council. There were a few things Ned wanted to run by Robert, some having to do with the realm, and one having to do with a request Robert had made of Ned back in Winterfell. In front of them Ned had sprawled out two maps, one of the Crown Lands and the other the Storm Lands. In Ned's hand he held a scrap of parchment with what he wanted to discuss. "Well, let's get on with it. The less time I spend in this room, the better." Ned dipped his head in acknowledgement. "At Winterfell you said you wanted my help in fostering Tommen and Myrcella." Robert straightened up in his seat and leaned forward. The bored and uninterested look on his face fell away, and he gazed intently at Ned. It was good to see that while he didn't show the biggest of interest in Crown Prince Joffrey, Robert at least cared for Prince Tommen and Princess Myrcella. "You looked into it?" the king asked. "I did," Ned answered with a nod. It was one of the reasons he had been so busy. "I spoke with some of the people at court from both the Crown Lands and the Storm Lands, and used the same logic I used in deciding who to foster Rob and Jon with. For Myrcella, I propose fostering her with Lord Riker of Duskendale." Here Ned pointed to the city on the map, not that Robert didn't know where it was. "The Rikers are a relatively new house, but they are one of the richest houses in the Crown Lands, so building good relations with them is smart." "They fought for the Mad King," Robert muttered. It was true the Rikers had been loyal to Aerys, but the man had lifted them up from a knightly house without lands to one of the premier houses of the Crown Lands. It made sense for them to be loyal to Aerys, and Robert would be smart to secure their loyalty to him. Half the realm did, Ned reminded him. "The Dun Fort is a few days' ride from here, should you or the Queen wish to visit. Lord Riker doesn't have any daughters around Myrcella's age, but he does have a handful of nieces who are. And Tommen. Lord Buckler of Bronze Eggett." Again, Ned pointed to the location. "Ralph's a good man." Ned knew Robert was fond of Ralph Buckler. He was one of the first Storm Lords to pledge support when Robert arrived in the Stormlands to call his banners at the start of the war. That was one of the reasons why he chose Bronze Eggett. There were a few more powerful lords in the Stormlands, but they were too close to Dorne for Ned's liking. He knew the Martells were still bitter about what happened to Princess Elia and her children, not that he could blame them. While he didn't think they would be so brazen as to make a move against a prince of the realm, Ned felt it was better to be safe than sorry. A 10-day ride from here, between King's Landing and Storm's End, both seats of your power. Lord Buckler has 4 sons, the youngest of whom is of age with Tommen. Robert's hand disappeared into his beard, to rub at his chin, as it often did when he was in thought. It was a habit Ned had noticed he had picked up sometime since he had last seen him on Pike. "I agree they are both good choices. Let me ponder this for a few days, and speak with Cersei, before making a decision." "Of course." Ned rolled up the maps since he no longer had any use of them. There was a drawer in the room where maps like this were stored, but he would wait until after the meeting before putting them away. "Is that all?" Robert asked, making a move to rise. "No, Your Grace." Robert grumbled but leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms across his chest and harumphed. Ned felt a smile making its way across his face but repressed it. There was so much of the boy he had grown up with still evident in this man who was king that sometimes Ned couldn't help but let better memories wash over him. "Stannis hasn't responded to the raven sent to him, and it has been over 2 weeks. We have heard nothing about him stirring from Dragonstone." Robert scowled and his eyebrows furrowed in annoyance. When Stannis sets his mind to something he rarely deters from it. He has set his mind to abandoning his post, for a reason he will not give, and nothing we write will change it. I will strip him of Master of Ships and declare it to the realm. I assume you have someone in mind to replace him. I have two options for you to consider. Lord Montfort Valerian of Driftmark. Ned noticed Robert's frown. Montfort's father had served as Master of Ships for the Mad King. While their wealth has waned, the Valerians still boast one of the strongest navies in the kingdoms. And Driftmark guards the entrance to Blackwater Bay. There is a reason the Masters of Ships has been a Valerian more often than not. Stannis will see it as an insult, replacing him with one of his sworn lords, but then again what doesn't Stannis see as an insult? Who is the other? Lord Paxter Redwyne of the Arbor. Not much needed to be said about Lord Redwyne. His house controlled the second largest fleet in the Seven Kingdoms, after the Royal Fleet. Paxter had joined his liege lord, Mace Tyrell, in siding with the Targaryens during the war. His fleet had blockaded Shipbreaker Bay, preventing any resupply from reaching Storm's End by sea during the year-long siege that had only been lifted when Ned had arrived with his northern army, a moon's turn after the death of the Mad King. A siege that had seen Stannis, Renly, and most of the garrison almost starved to death. Even with the Onion Knight's timely arrival, dozens of men had succumbed to starvation. There had been rumors of cannibalism, but Robert would not let such rumors linger long. Another name Stannis will be insulted by. Is that what you're trying to do, Ned? Insult my brother? Ned had been told that Robert had done two slights to Stannis that the Middle Baratheon had been unable to get over. The first was Robert sleeping with one of Lady Florent's cousins in the wedding bed on the night of Stannis' wedding to Slyss Florent, before Stannis himself could. The second was giving him Dragonstone to rule and not Storm's End, the ancestral seat of their family. Ned had no comment on the wedding night situation, as that was indeed quite the insult, but he knew Robert gave Dragonstone to Stannis because it was the ancestral seat of the previous power and it was always given to the heir of the kingdom to rule, which Stannis was at the end of the war. What Stannis saw as a slight, Robert thought was an honor. Even though their personalities were different and the two often clashed, Ned knew Robert loved his brother. He just wondered if Stannis knew it too. Besides Stannis, they are the two most competent candidates. Unless you want me to look at an Iron Islander. Bar as if those fucking Ironborn know shit about cooperating with others. That's the last thing the realm needs. Very well, let me think that over as well. 2 of 4 things were discussed, and Robert was still in the room paying attention. If nothing else was accomplished that day, Ned would consider it a win. Speaking on the small council, I wonder if we shouldn't look into replacing Grand Maester Pycelle. Pycelle? The king's eyebrows rose in surprise at the suggestion. He's a bit old, but still has his wits about him. During council meetings he's asleep more than he's awake, Ned stated bluntly. Robert would know that if he actually attended them. He's over 80 years old, and has held the position for 40 years. And he's a Lannister man like half the court, Ned wanted to say but dared not. I cannot unmake a Grand Maester, Robert pointed out. That is for the Citadel to decide, as you well know. We can at least write to the Citadel suggesting the idea. I will write a letter and if you find it satisfactory, you can sign it and I will send it out. Robert sighed. Very well then. Thank you. Now there's just one more thing I wanted to discuss. By the gods, Ned, you're worse than Jon was. This time Ned allowed the smile to make its way onto his face as memories of his youth, during his fostering in the Vale, came to mind. As a teen, Robert had always been exasperated with anything that didn't involve fighting, riding and hunting. As an adult, that had expanded to include drinking and whoring. It had only been through the nagging of Jon Arryn that Robert had received a proper education, and likely that was the reason Robert did any ruling of the realm. It looked like Ned had picked up where Jon had left off. I can always go back to Winterfell, if your grace wishes. Oh no, you'd like nothing more than to go home so you can freeze your ass off in that empty land of yours. You will sweat yourself to death here with me in this shit-smelling city and you will like it. Ned chuckled before taking a deep breath and moving on to the final topic. The Dragon Pit. Robert scowled again. What about the blasted thing? I want to tear it down. It's the last overt symbol of Targaryen power in this city, a reminder of their rule, but the Targaryens are gone and it is the Baratheons who rule now. It's a ruin, just like their dynasty. Ned had thought Robert would be all for the idea of destroying it simply because it had been built by the Targaryens. Either he had misjudged his friend's hatred of the Dragon Lords, or he hadn't realized Robert was astute enough to see the symbolism of the destroyed and warped Dragon Pit and how it reflected the status of House Targaryen. He would have to try the practical approach. It's the largest building in the city by far, and it hasn't been in use in over a century. The city's population is at a tipping point, and not nearly as many as I had hoped are leaving to head north. We need the space knocking it down will provide. We can build houses, shops, even a godswood open to the people. Tear it down or leave it as is, do as you wish. It doesn't matter to me. Thank you. Is that all? The king asked, a glimmer of hope in his voice. That is all. Robert stood up so fast he knocked his chair over. He didn't bother to pick it up as he quickly walked from the room, as if afraid Ned was going to say, "Just joking, I have 10 more topics to discuss." Ned shook his head ruefully as he stood from his own seat and picked up Robert's chair from where it had fallen. Once it was up in its proper place, he grabbed the rolled-up maps and moved to put them away. If they were going to tear down the Dragon Pit and build new buildings there they would need architects, stonemasons, and builders, amongst dozens of other professions. The crown would pay for everything but they would also own whatever buildings went up, and could rent them out for monthly fees to make back their money, and then some. It would be money spent in the near term but the profit would help in the long term. Ned stood with the king on the walls of the Red Keep, overlooking the city. With them was only one member of the Kingsguard, Sir Jaime. As he stood there in his white armor, the man looked exactly like one would imagine a knight to look. Although he couldn't see them from his position, Ned knew that 2 of the others, Sir Mandon and Sir Preston, were down in the courtyard below, blocking the stairs up to the battlements. Robert had wished to be alone in his contemplation. From where they stood, they could see most of the city spread out before them. The wealthy citizens with their homes and shops atop Visnyas Hill and Rhaenys Hill, and the rest who scratched out a living on the lower-lying lands between the 3 hills that made up the city. Atop Rhaenys Hill was the Dragon Pit, which workers had started working on dismantling a few days ago. Already the remnants of the large dome that had once sat atop the structure had been removed, along with all the stones that littered the inside of the building from previous collapses, and the towering walls were slowly being shortened stone by stone. Dismantling the damn thing would likely take half the year and then it would be another half a year for all the new buildings to go up. They had just come back from seeing off Myrcella as she traveled to Duskendale to start her fostering with Lord Riker. The princess was accompanied by Sir Aris Oakurt, 10 members of the Lannister Guard, and a pair of ladies-in-waiting, the daughters of lesser lords who were a few years older than Myrcella. Tommen had left yesterday for Bronze Egget with Sir Meryn Trant and 10 members of the Baratheon Guard in tow. Tommen would be gone for a couple of years, and once he turned 12 he would be sent to Squire for a night. The options would be many, and that included members of the Kingsguard if Robert was so inclined. Perhaps Sir Jaime would like to have his nephew as a squire. Cersei had been seething in silent anger after Tommen left, and that anger had exploded after they made their way back to the Red Keep today. Robert had allowed her to scream at him for a minute before walking away, Cersei's screeching following them as they went. They had been standing at this spot long enough to see that there was noticeable movement in the sun above them. For someone with the temper he had, Robert could be rather stoic in moments where others would rage. "Did I make the correct decision, sending my children away?" Robert asked after a moment of silence. Cersei's anger must have shaken Robert. Cat was devastated when Robb was fostered, and when Bran left to become a page, Ned stated after a moment of thought. Mothers never wish to be separated from their children, but Robb is a better man for it and my family's relations with the Karstarks has never been stronger. The king took in Ned's words with a grim look before turning to his Kingsguard protector. "What about you, Kingslayer? Did your parents send you away in the attempt to make you a better person?" The Kingslayer shifted from one foot to the other and rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. "I squired for Lord Sumner Crickehole from 11 to 15. I like to imagine my mother would have cried when I left but, well, she was dead and my father isn't the crying type." Ned disliked the smirk that was on the Kingslayer's face, though he found he disliked much and more about the man ever since he had walked into the throne room all those years ago to see a young Kingsguard member who had broken his oath and killed the first king he had sworn to protect. Ned had wanted the night men had taken to calling the Kingslayer sent to the wall as punishment for breaking his sacred oath, but instead Robert had let him keep his place in the Kingsguard at the urging of Jon Arryn. Home. Perhaps you are right, Ned, it's for. The ground beneath Rhaenys Hill erupted outward in a cloud of green flames with an ear-shattering boom. Every building that sat atop the hill was destroyed, the stone and wood of the various structures tossed high into the air. The force of the explosion washed over them on the wall, but they were far enough away where it was just hot air blowing against their faces. Those on the streets below them were not nearly as lucky. In the blink of an eye Ned watched as hundreds of men, women, and children were swallowed up by the green flames. All three of them could only gape in shock as the stone and wood and bodies of anyone unfortunate enough to be on the hill when it exploded, started raining back down to earth. The green fire, which could only be wildfire, caught the nearby buildings and began to spread. Brutal screams of pain and fear ripped through the city. People were starting to panic, and panic amongst such a large population would lead to even more deaths. Ned didn't know if this was an attack or some other cruel joke of the gods, all he knew was that they needed to do something. Ned turned to the king, and noticed the look on Sir Jaime's face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Chapter 11, Arya. Arya. If there was one thing that Arya could say she had learned over the years, it was that lessons were stupid. She could do sums better than Sansa could, answering Maester Luwin's questions far quicker than her sister, and she was 2 years younger. She could read and write almost as well as her sister too. And if those were it, then maybe she could see why lessons were something she needed to participate in. Sums and reading and writing seemed like useful things she would need to know, even if she never found herself in charge of a keep of her own. Except they weren't all she was being taught. Why did she need to know how to sew and embroider? What use was there in learning the lyrics to all those stupid songs? What use was it learning the banners of the southern houses along with the northern ones, or being taught the history of Westeros as a whole, when nothing below the neck concerned her? As far as she was concerned, there was no further need for lessons with Maester Luwin or, and here she shuddered, with Septa Mordane. So she skipped her lessons as often as possible. The problem arose when she skipped them too many times in a row, because then her mother would be informed, and before Arya knew it, she'd be getting a stern, sometimes shrill, lecture about why lessons were important. Afterwards she'd attend lessons for a few weeks, sometimes a month or two, depending on how long her ears rang from the dressing down, before she'd start skipping them again, and the pattern would repeat. On the rare occasions her father would be the one to talk to her, expressing his disappointment in her for not taking her lessons seriously. He would comment on her wild behavior and mention about the wolf blood he thought she had, like his sister and older brother had when they were alive. Then her father would get this faraway look in his eyes as he remembered his dead siblings. When that happened, she'd attend the lessons a bit longer, to try to get rid of her father's disappointment, but it would never last. When her father had informed her that Sansa, and the ever-annoying Jane Poole, would be joining him at King's Landing, she thought that would just leave her and Beth Castle, who was a few years younger, as the only attendees of Septa Mordane's lessons. Like Sansa and Jane, Beth had her head in the clouds and thought a lot about handsome knights and ladies in distress. Arya had forgotten that Robb's new wife, Winifred, would be joining them. And in turn, she was joined by her sister Wylla, which at first was only supposed to last a few days, but was now to last a few years. Winifred and Wylla joining in on her lessons had kept Arya at them longer than usual. She was interested in the two of them, Winifred because she was to be her good sister, and Wylla because of her green hair. However, the interest had waned, and the day Jon had gone to visit Castle Black, and her father and Sansa left to head to King's Landing, with Bran accompanying them as Sir Robar's page, she had started skipping her lessons again. Until her mother had found out. Beautiful stitchwork, Wylla, Septa Mordane praised, smiling at the green-haired girl. Wylla blushed lightly under the praise and gave the Septa a small smile. Arya had the tiniest of hopes that one of Winifred or Wylla would be just as bad as needlework as she was. Yet that wasn't the case. Arya looked at her own work and scowled. It was terrible. The stitching was uneven with large gaps in between. To her untrained eye, in the 5 years since she had started joining Sansa in these lessons, it didn't look like she had improved in her needlework at all. Why couldn't Septa Mordane have traveled with Sansa to King's Landing, and leave Arya the hell alone? Robb says you like to ride, Arya. Winifred asked in a casual way, no doubt noticing the scowl on her face. Arya looked up and blinked at her good sister. I do. I'm better than all my brothers, even Jon, she boasted. Robb says the same, Winifred said with a smile that Arya returned. There was a knock at the door, before it was pushed open and one of the house guards stepped into the room. Pardon the interruption, Septa Mordane, but guests are arriving and Lord Robb wishes Lady Arya and Lady Winifred to come to the yard to greet them. At first Arya scowled at being called a lady, she hated when the guards called her that. She wasn't a lady, she was Arya. But then as she processed all of the words said, she felt her eyebrows go up. She hadn't been informed of any guests arriving, so who was it that had come? Come, Arya, Winifred said as she stood, let us greet the newest guests to Winterfell. Arya didn't need to be told twice. She dropped what she was working on to the floor and quickly fled the room ahead of her good sister. She had a suspicion that Winifred knew who the guests were, which meant that they were expected, at least by Robb, but despite having a general hatred of being kept out of the loop, she didn't find herself caring in this instance. Whatever she had been kept out of the loop of had gotten her out of the rest of her lessons, and that was good enough for her. Nymeria, who had been laying just outside the doorway of her lessons, shot to her feet as Arya ran by. The direwolf easily fell into step behind Arya as she bounded down the steps. Together they arrived in the courtyard where her mother, brothers, Maester Stillowin, Sir Roderick, Grey Wind, and Shaggydoke were all already gathered. Except they were gathered in front of the Hunter's Gate, the one that opened up to the west and to the Wolf's Wood. It was where the still-in-progress Wolf's Road started. Based on the clothes her mother and brothers were wearing, Rickon no doubt was forced to wear, the guests were nobles. It had to be one of the Wolf's Wood houses, like the Glovers or Forresters, she thought. The guards who stood on the western battlements tensed as 10 men rode through the open Hunter's Gate. They were dressed in chainmail and leather, with the bear of House Mormont flying above their heads. Behind the 10 men was a woman who rode next to a wagon pulled by 2 horses. The wagon was being steered by another man in chainmail and leather, and next to him were 2 young girls who looked to be around Arya's age. It was the woman who caught Arya's attention. She was a short, stout, grey-haired woman who looked to only come up to her mother's chin. She wore, under her green surcoat adorned with the Mormont sigil, patched ringmail, and at her hip hung a spiked mace. She was quite possibly the most interesting woman Arya had ever seen. While Arya didn't know who the woman was specifically, she knew she was a Mormont, and would have been able to tell even without the bear sigil. The Mormonts were one of the only houses in the north where almost every woman wore armor and carried a weapon. Lady Mage, her mother, greeted, smiling warmly at the older woman as she dismounted her horse. Lady Catelyn Mage Mormont greeted in turn. The 2 women hugged, briefly, before Mage bowed her head to Robb. Lord Robb. Lady Mage, thank you for coming. Thank you for allowing my daughters the privilege of fostering at Winterfell. Arya felt her eyebrows go up at those words. Fostering at Winterfell. She gave a closer look at the 2 daughters in question as they climbed down from their horses and approached their mother. Mage guided them both in front of her, placing a hand on each of their shoulders and beamed with pride. This is Jarell, she nodded at the shorter of the 2 girls, and this is Lyanna. As it turned out, Jarell was the older of the 2. She was stocky in build with thick black hair and brown eyes. Lyanna was 3 years younger than Jarell, 2 years younger than Arya, but was already taller than both, almost as tall as her mother, Lady Mage. She too had the Mormont black hair and brown eyes. Welcome to Winterfell, my ladies, Robb greeted, bowing low. If they were in the south, Robb would be expected to kiss their knuckles. Arya was glad she was in the north as she didn't want any snot-nosed noblemen slobbering on her hand. We're honored to have you here. This is my wife Winifred, my sister Arya, and my brother Rickon. This is Shaggydoke, Rickon all but shouted, petting his direwolf whose tongue lolled out of his mouth. There were more words exchanged between everyone, but Arya wasn't paying attention to any of it. Instead she found her eyes drawn to a small mace that hung at Jarell's side. It was a fraction of the size of the one Mage Mormont had, maybe the size of Arya's fist, and it didn't have the pointy spikes, but the fact that a girl only a year older than her was not only trained in a weapon, but also wielded one, was mind-boggling to Arya. Why couldn't she have been born a Mormont? Arya wondered what type of weapon she'd wield if she had. She was pretty good with a bow, at least she thought so. Definitely better than Bran was. And she had used the practice swords and shields Bran had trained with ever since her younger brother could walk, which were now being used by Rickon, and she thought she was alright with them. The older Bran got, the bigger and heavier the weapons, and more recently, on those occasions she managed to grab the training weapons without anyone being the wiser. She found the shield getting too heavy for her to lift and hold up, at least with just the one arm. Nymeria butted her head against Arya's hand, drawing her from her thoughts as she absent-mindedly scratched her direwolf behind its ear. And of course rooms have already been prepared for you, and some of our men can help you bring your belongings up to them. Arya, they are staying in the rooms near Sansa's and yours. Can you please show them to them? Fine. Follow me, please, she added at the look her mother gave her. Mage moved to the wagon and began directing the Winterfell guards, who stepped forward to help carry the trunks that loaded the back of the wagon. Jarell and Lyanna followed after Arya and Nymeria, keeping a healthy distance between themselves and the direwolf. She's not going to bite you, Arya said in annoyance, noticing the two girls several feet behind her. She only bites those I tell her to. Not that Arya knew that for a fact. She had not yet told her direwolf to bite anyone. It was possible Nymeria wouldn't bite anyone Arya told her to. It was also possible Nymeria would bite whoever she wished to bite, whether Arya wanted her to or not. With careful steps, Jarell approached Nymeria with one hand outstretched and the other gripping the handle of the mace at her hip. Not that the mace would be of any use against a direwolf, Arya thought. Even though she still had a lot of growing to Odo, Nymeria would rip the arm off before Jarell could even swing her weapon. However, Nymeria allowed herself to be pet, and seeing her sister was still in one piece, Lyanna stepped forward to pet the wolf as well. The direwolf was, like her owner, indifferent to the attention paid to it. Nymeria allowed the girls to run their fingers through her fur because they weren't a threat. You all have direwolves? Lyanna asked, looking up from Nymeria. My brothers and sister, yes. When Jon comes back from Castle Black with Ghost there will be 4 direwolves here. Nymeria, tired of being pet, bounded away from the 3 of them and, if Arya was to guess, went in search of either Grey Wind or Shagged Oak to play. We hear them sometimes, Jarell said, on the northern shores of Bear Island. Depending on the wind, their howls carry across the Bay of Ice. Arya led them up the stairs and down the corridor that led to where she and Sansa slept, their rooms adjacent to each other. There were 6 more rooms near theirs, one of them already occupied by Wyler Mondaly. Jarell picked the room on the other side of Arya's. As the older Mormont daughter looked about the room, Arya stood in the doorway, casting subtle looks at the mace. Do you want to hold it? Jarell asked. Arya felt the heat rise in her face as she realized she hadn't been as subtle as she thought. Could I? She asked, trying to keep the eagerness out of her voice. Jarell answered by taking the mace from her hip and holding it out to Arya. The newest Stark she-wolf took the mace and looked at it in wonder. It was a little heavier than the training swords she had used, but most of its weight was in the flanged head. She carefully swung it a few times, careful not to hit Jarell or any of the furniture in the room. How long have you had it? Arya asked between swings. A few months. Mother says I'll continue learning how to wield it here under your master at arms. The jealousy Arya had felt earlier came back in full. Her mother refused to let her train with any weapons even though she begged them over and over, and her mother was going to let Jarell train. Arya held the mace back out for Jarell to take, no longer having any desire to hold it. A mace wasn't the weapon for her anyway. Lady Mage and her men only stayed for 3 nights before they departed to head back to Bear Island. Arya had spent the dinner of those 3 nights peppering Lady Mormont with questions about living on Bear Island, and why the women there were some of the few in the 7 kingdoms who were trained how to fight. Bear Island doesn't have a large population, which always made us easy prey for the raiders of the Iron Islands. Here a look was shot at Theon, who sat on the other side of the table, sharing a joke with Robb that had Rickon looking between them confused. The Greyjoy did not seem to notice the dark look Lady Mage had for him. On Bear Island every child learns to fear krakens rising from the sea. Ever since the arrival of the Mormont sisters, every morning after she broke her fast, Arya found herself being accompanied by her mother to her lessons, the ones she had with Maester Luwin and shared with everyone, including Rickon and Robb, who swore he had no other duties that needed his attention in the mornings anymore. "I don't understand why I have to take these stupid lessons," Arya argued one morning. "Of course you don't," her mother said with a shake of her head. "You are young and willful, but when you're older, and married." "I don't want to marry anyone." "Then you'll appreciate all these lessons you are to take." Then when those lessons were over with, and she was to go to her lessons with Septa Mordane, which was for just the girls, including the Mormont sisters, they were escorted by Rob. He made it seem like he was doing so to spend a few extra minutes with his new bride, but Arya knew it was for her, to make sure she made it to the lesson like she was supposed to, and Rob confirmed so. "Don't give me that look, Arya," Rob said on the third day of escorting them. "Do you think I like having to keep an eye on you? If you'd actually listened to Mother, neither of us would be in this situation." Jarell and Lyanna had never taken lessons with a Septa before, since Winterfell and White Harbor were the only two places in the north that had one. That being said, they did learn the things Septa Mordane taught, like needlework and songs, just from a non-pious woman. Septa Mordane also taught lessons in the faith of the Seven, but until Winifred and Wyler had arrived, it had only been her mother and Sansa who had participated in them, as Arya and the rest of her siblings followed the old gods. Arya had thought things like needlework was only being forced on her because her mother was Southron, so to find that northern women learned it too was baffling. However, being escorted to her lessons by her family members to make sure she attended them wasn't the worst part of the past few weeks. It was watching from a distance as Jarell attended the training in the yard, taught by Sir Roderick and Horlis Mollin, the new captain of the guard that everyone called Hal, how to properly use the mace she had been gifted for her 11th name day. She had asked again if she could train with the others, especially because Jarell was able to, but her mother had again told her no. She thought of writing to Father in King's Landing, to see what he would say. He was of the north, and had often compared her to her aunt, who she heard stories of being a wild spirit that bucked a lot of the social norms. If either of her parents would allow her to train with a weapon, it would be her father. Surely once he heard that Jarell Mormont was fostering at Winterfell, and training with a weapon, then he would allow Arya to do the same. He would see how unfair it all was to her and do his best to rectify it. It was after another dreadful afternoon of lessons with Septa Mordane that Arya found herself watching as Robb, Theon, and the new house guards finished up their training. Nymeria and Grey Wind wrestled with each other off to the side. Unfortunately for her direwolf, Grey Wind was the biggest of the pack and he knew how to use his size. Jarell was with the guards, having left the lessons with the Septa early, and was being instructed by Horlis Mollin on the proper footwork required when wielding a mace, which was apparently different than when wielding a sword. Internally, Arya seethed with jealousy. She was interrupted from her envy by her mother coming into the area, a scrap of parchment clutched in her hand. She walked quickly through the training men, each pair stopping their sparring and stepping out of her way as she approached. "Robb, we received a letter from your father. He wrote to give me permission to train with the guards," Arya thought, growing with excitement. Her father must have heard from Robb or her mother that Jarell was at Winterfell training to wield a mace, and he thought it was unfair to Arya, so he was giving her permission to do the same. She eagerly moved over to her mother. "There was an explosion at King's Landing," her mother continued. Arya felt her previous excitement drain away as she realized how childish her thoughts had been. Of course her father wouldn't be writing about that. The men who were closest to her mother got confused and uncertain looks on their faces. "An explosion?" Robb asked, his own brows furrowed. "Apparently there was wildfire underneath the dragon pit. A lot of it. He doesn't go into details, but thousands are dead, and over 100 buildings have burned to the ground." "Was it an attack?" Sir Roderick asked, moving from where he stood in front of the men to stand by her mother and brother. "Are we to raise the banners?" "He doesn't say," her mother said with a shake of her head. "He said he wrote to let us know he, and everyone of the North, is safe. He didn't want us to worry should word reach us." The men murmured amongst each other as Robb pursed his lips in deep thought. She could tell her brother was thinking of how he should react to this. He was the Stark in Winterfell, and the acting lord while their father was away. It was on him to make decisions if a decision was required to be made. "If father wanted us to raise the banners, he would have said so," Robb finally said. "Either this isn't an attack or, if it is, they aren't aware of that fact yet. All we know is that King's Landing has lost a lot of lives and buildings. We should write to Lord Marndaly to send some ships with a gift of lumber from the north to King's Landing to assist in the rebuilding efforts. Arya watched her mother nod approvingly at Rob's suggestion. And we should see if the Marndalys have any supply of stone we can send as well. We can have the mountain clans send him more if needed. Rob and her mother walked off to where Maester Lewin's rooms were, at the base of the rookery, to write the letter to Lord Marndaly. Grey Wind trotted after Rob, while Nymeria quickly fell in line next to Arya. As she scratched at the side of Nymeria's head, Arya found her gaze shifting to Jarell, the envy from earlier coming back in full force. Maybe she could tell Hal that her mother gave her approval for Arya to train. She'd only be able to do it on days that Sir Roderick wasn't around, but perhaps it would work. Hal wasn't as close to her mother as Jorah was, so it was possible he wouldn't know any better. But then she shook her head. All Hal had to do was ask her mother and he would know the truth. The only thing she would be able to do was what she had been doing for years already, sneaking into the armory to grab the training weapons and then practicing by herself in the Godswood. Sometimes she convinced Bran to practice with her, but that hadn't happened after he left to be a page for Sir Robar Royce, and that included the month they had been here for Rob's wedding. A shout went up from the guard at the north gate, drawing her attention. Riders approaching. For a second time, the envy toward Jarell was forgotten as Arya's eyes widened and she ran to the steps that led to the top of the northern battlements, Nymeria at her side. Together, She-Wolf and Direwolf ran up the steps so they could see who was approaching. A few miles to the north, emerging from the trees that obstructed the view of the King's Road as it entered the Wolf's Wood, were 7 riders, one of them a child. Trotting along at their side was a very large dog. It was hard to make out, but Arya was sure 6 of the riders, including the child, wore red and gold, while the lone rider next to the dog wore the grey and white of House Stark. Then she realized the child wasn't a child, it was a dwarf, and the dog wasn't a dog, it was a direwolf. Which could only mean one thing. Jon's back. Chapter 12, Robb 4. Robb 4. Despite Maester Lewin's offer to pen the correspondence himself, Robb Stark had insisted on writing the letter to Lord Marndaly with his own hand. He carefully worded the request for lumber and stone to be sent from White Harbor to King's Landing, framing it as a generous gift from the north for which House Stark would more than compensate the Lord of White Harbor. Though he had little doubt that Lord Marndaly would fulfill the request regardless of who wrote the letter, Robb believed certain matters required his personal touch, to demonstrate not only Stark honor but genuine care. The wording had been shaped by both his thoughts and his mother's careful guidance before being delivered to Maester Lewin for folding and sealing. It was then that raised voices from the courtyard below drew their attention. "Sounds like someone's arrived," Robb said, setting the quill aside and rising. "Were we expecting anyone, Mother?" "Not to my knowledge," Catelyn replied, standing from her seat near the hearth. "Perhaps it is Jon, returned from Castle Black," Maester Lewin offered mildly, though the glance Catelyn shot him at the mention of her husband's bastard son could have turned milk sour. Her silent disapproval spoke volumes, but she said nothing aloud. It had been se'nights since Jon had departed with Uncle Benjen and Tyrion Lannister to visit the Night's Watch. While it was always known that Jon would eventually return, Robb was sure his mother had some hope that he would have joined the Night's Watch against their father's wishes. But Jon was his brother and Robb's heart lifted at the thought of seeing him again. Driven by curiosity, Robb strode swiftly from the Maester's tower into the main courtyard. He saw no arrival at first, only Mikken the blacksmith, exiting the forge with something carefully wrapped in cloth. The past several weeks Mikken had been kept busy making weapons and armor for the new House Guard recruits. Robb wondered if maybe they should bring in another armorer, or at least an apprentice to work under Mikken. While it was not always the case, there could be times when Mikken was at the forge from sunrise to sunset for weeks at a time. Hard work like that could not be easy for the man. "Mikken. Has someone come?" Robb called. "I am Lord. Your brother Jon is back from Castle Black with Tyrion Lannister. They're at the northern gates, where I'm heading now." Robb grinned, pleased that Maester Lewin was correct and Jon was finally back. "Allow me to join you then." As they walked under the stone bridge connecting the armory to the Great Keep, Robb glanced at the bundle Mikken carried. It was too short and slender to be a sword. Even Rickon's training sword was bigger than that. "What's that you've got?" Robb asked. "Something your brother asked me to make before he left," Mikken replied simply, offering no more. Rob left it at that. If John wanted him to know, he'd tell him. They passed between the inner walls, the Godswood on one side and the ancient Lyco yard on the other. The way opened to the North Gate yard, where Rob saw Jon, Arya, Tyrion Lannister, Sir Roderick, Horlys Mollin, and a handful of house guards. Tyrion's escort dismounted nearby, their faces weary from the road. Ghost, Nymeria, and Grey Wind were already leaping and nipping in greeting, their excited yelps carried across the yard, and the sounds of excited barks that grew louder by the second meant Shaggydoke was on his way to join them. Arya threw herself at Jon, hugging him fiercely. He returned the embrace with a warm grin. "You're not in black yet," Rob called as he approached. "Not yet," Jon answered, his grin widening as Arya stepped back. Rob clapped him on the shoulder before turning to their guest. "Welcome back to Winterfell, Lord Tyrion. I know it is a long journey from the wall to here. You and your men must be exhausted and famished. Please, join us for supper in the Great Hall while I see to your rooms." "Most kind, Lord Rob." Tyrion gave a slight bow. "I confess, I am half-starved." "Then please, follow me." Rob turned to lead the imp and his men to the Great Hall. As he did so, he saw Mikken lift the cloth and show Jon what he had made. Jon grinned widely and heartily praised Mikken's work, which only raised Rob's curiosity more. During dinner, Rob had told Jon he wanted to speak with him afterwards. That is why they found themselves in Father's Solar after the last of the desserts had been eaten. Neither of them sat in the chair usually reserved for their father. Jon would never sit in it himself, as he knew it would one day be Rob's, and Rob still felt too weird sitting in his father's chair. Sprawled out by the door, almost on top of each other, were Grey Wind and Ghost. Both direwolves had their eyes closed and appeared to be sleeping off dinner. Rob informed his brother of what had happened at Winterfell in his absence, as well as about the explosion in King's Landing. In turn Jon told of his trip to Castle Black, and the unsettling news that rangers kept disappearing north of the wall. Hopefully Uncle Benjen would be able to get to the bottom of the disappearances. Grey Wind shifted about from his position on the floor, kicking Ghost in the side. Ghost did not even open his eyes, just rolled in the other direction, away from his larger littermate. "Have you noticed anything about Ghost?" Rob asked, the behavior of the direwolves reminding him of the thoughts he had been having about them the past few weeks. Jon looked at his direwolf with furrowed brows. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it exactly. Grey Wind seems to know when to show up, like when I'm done with lessons or sword training. I don't have to call him or anything, he's just there." "He does seem attuned to me," Jon said, as Ghost opened his eyes, raised his head, and looked at him. The direwolf tilted his head to the side before lowering it back to the floor and closing his eyes again. "I didn't want to fill Arya's head with fantasy or confuse Rickon," Rob said softly, "but perhaps they truly are gifts of the old gods." "Perhaps," Jon said uncertainly. "We'll see how they grow. Ghost and Grey Wind are changing fast. We should watch Nymeria and Shaggydoke as well." Rob nodded his head in agreement. "Speaking of Arya, I need you to talk with her. She keeps skipping her lessons, and Mother is at her wit's end." "You think she'll listen to me?" Jon asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're her favorite sibling," Rob said with a shrug. "If she'll listen to anyone, it will be you." Jon gave a knowing smile and reached for the bundle he'd kept by his side since dinner. It was still wrapped in the cloth, which gave no hints as to what the item was. Rob had been planning to ask what it was, but it looked like he had no need to ask. Jon would show it to him on his own initiative. "I actually have an idea on how to get Arya to stick with her lessons, but your mother is not going to like it." "Oh." His mother wanted nothing more than to not have to constantly fight Arya to attend her lessons. Rob thought his mother would like almost anything that made that a reality. Jon pulled the cloth off of the item, revealing it to be a sword, but not any type of sword Rob had seen before, at least in person. It was shorter than a standard longsword by almost a foot and much thinner. There didn't seem to be any type of edge to the blade, but the point was just as sharp as any other sword Rob had seen. It was not anything they had been trained in and would probably be the perfect weapon for someone without a lot of strength, since it did not have the weight of a longsword. "That's a Bravo Sea sword. What does that have to do with, oh?" Rob's eyes widened as he realized what Jon was implying. "I planned to give it to her quietly, but if we offer her training with it, on the condition that she attend her other lessons. She'll stick with them no matter how much she hates it. You're right, my mother is not going to like it. Nor will she agree with it. I'll write to father. You soften your mother. Between us, she might agree if Lord Stark allows it. You give me the harder task, Robb grumbled. You're right, let me talk with your mother. I'm sure she'll listen to what I say, Jon said with a grin. Robb rolled his eyes. Sometimes he missed who his brother was before he fostered with the Umbers, back when he was sullen and broody. The next morning Robb broached the subject. Catelyn was predictably furious, dismissing the notion as foolishness. But Robb persisted gently, suggesting it as a way to ensure Arya obeyed her other duties. It would take a sennight or so at the earliest until they heard any reply from their father on the issue, so he would wait a few days before bringing it up again. Jon's return, and subsequent attending of the lessons again, gave Robb a few extra moments in the morning as it freed him up from escorting Arya to her lessons with the scepter. He took the extra time to work with Theon on improving his use with a bow. Theon had stopped attending morning lessons after he turned 16 years old, which was when Robb would be done with them as well. Instead he usually slept in a little later, often because he'd spend his nights at an inn in Wintertown. And while the Greyjoy heir didn't need to attend training in the afternoon, he still did so to keep his skills with a sword sharp. Robb let the arrow fly and missed the target completely. He scowled in annoyance, which only deepened when Theon hit a few inches from the bullseye. "Are you even trying, Stark?" Theon asked with a laugh. "Arya's better with a bow." "Shut up, Greyjoy, or I'll knock you senseless," Robb muttered. Rather than be intimidated, Theon only laughed harder. Robb knocked and let loose a few more arrows at the target, but by the time they were joined by the house guards and Jon, he had only hit the target once. Theon had hit every time, and was smiling widely at Robb by the end. Sir Rodrik had the idea of testing the house guard recruits against Jon, Robb, and Theon, to see how they'd hold up against those who knew how to fight. Robb did not know what the Master-at-Arms was expecting, but it was not a good showing. The recruits were slow, uncertain, and sloppy. Even Theon, no great swordsman, put them down with ease. Sir Rodrik lectured sternly as the recruits gasped on the ground. Jon, patient and instructive, demonstrated flaws and corrections as he fought. Castle Black's training had sharpened his eye for weakness. His father took the best of the guard to King's Landing with him, Jory, Alyn, Harwin, and Wyl amongst dozens of others. It would take years before any of these men were on their level, and it still left Winterfell with over 70 guards less than normal. He knew in the south, lords would offer spots in their guard to those who fared well in the tourneys held down there. Robb pondered holding a tourney at the harvest feast. Not a southern tourney with jousts and fancy rings, but a brutal melee, a bunch of men beating the shit out of each other with weapons, was something northerners could get behind. Northmen understood a good fight better than tilting at lances. It was an idea worth considering. Before dinner he stopped off in the kitchens to check in on the newest addition to the kitchen staff, the wildling Osha. In the days after her capture, she had been kept under lock and key in the dungeons, 2 guards posted outside her cell at all hours. Winifred had been the one to speak on her behalf, claiming that Osha alone among her group had shown no desire to harm her or Wyler. After quiet discussions with his mother and Maester Lewin, Robb had reluctantly agreed to offer the woman limited freedom. So long as she obeyed, she would be spared the chains of a cell, or worse, the chopping block. He found her near the great stone hearth, her hands sunk deep in a mound of dough, kneading fiercely. Her rough spun brown dress hung shapeless over her frame. Shackles still bound her ankles, a quiet reminder to her and to all who passed that she was no free woman of the north. She looked up at him as he approached and he could see the disdain on her face. "I know this must be hard for you," Robb said, indicating the kitchen around them. "Going from a wildle, free folk," he corrected, remembering the term the wildlings used to describe themselves, to working for one of us southern lords. He did his best to keep the sarcasm out of his voice at the last words. That wildlings thought everyone below the wall was a southerner was ridiculous. The Starks were of the north, as old as the hills and the first snows. Osha shrugged her shoulders, but the rest of her body language showed her frustration with the situation, how tense she stood, the amount of force and twisting she used when needing, the look in her eyes. Could be worse. Could be dead, or worse, turned into one of the undead. Undead. Rob asked, eyebrows going up. I. Her pale eyes flicked up, sharp and serious. The dead walk beyond the wall. That's why we ran south. Why we risked your swords. Better to need bread for a lord than join the others. The certainty in her voice made him uneasy, but he forced his face to remain calm. The dead walk, do they? He asked, raising a skeptical brow. Osha said nothing more, but the way she stared at him made it clear she believed every word. The rhythmic slap of dough on the board filled the silence. Rob nodded slowly, pretending thoughtfulness while inwardly dismissing the tale as wilderling superstition. Ghost stories told to frighten children and fools. If there was truth to such madness, the Night's Watch would have warned them. John would have said something when he returned from Castle Black. Wouldn't he? Unsettled, Rob left her to her labor and sought out Gage, the head cook, who stood nearby testing the heat of the ovens. How is she doing? Rob asked quietly. Gage glanced up, blushing a little under his beard, and Rob wondered if perhaps the cook had a crush on the wilderling. Gage's wife had died in childbirth several years earlier. Rob made a mental note to keep an eye on that. No complaints, Lord Gage said after a moment. She does her work, keeps quiet. No trouble from her. Not with me, not with the other staff. Seems to know her place. That's good to hear. Let me know if there's any changes, or she causes any problems. Lord. Of course. Rob gave a curt nod and left the kitchens behind, but the wilderling's words stuck with him. The dead walk beyond the wall. Nonsense, surely. But the way she'd said it with such certainty made it harder to shake from his mind. The first keep was in the northeast corner of Winterfell, against a section of the inner surrounding wall, near the broken tower, and across the pathway from the entrance to the Godswood. It had been abandoned centuries ago, sometime shortly after the Great Keep had been built, though the exact dates had been lost to history. Although it was called the First Keep, it was not the first keep built in Winterfell when Brandon the Builder razed the castle. There had been others, the exact number unknown, that had either been torn down or fallen on their own accord over the thousands of years the Starks had lived in the castle. The First Keep was the oldest of the buildings still remaining, and had been given the name of the First Keep when the Great Keep had been built to differentiate between the two. The courtyard between it and the North Gate was a lycoyard, filled with the graves of those who served the kings of Winter hundreds of years ago. The burial of servants in the lycoyard had been abandoned before the First Keep had been abandoned, likely due to running out of room to bury the bodies. Bran used to climb the walls of the First Keep, even though he was told multiple times not to. Rob was not sure if anyone had been inside the First Keep in decades. Until today, that is. He had decided he wanted to spend some of the money from Winifred's dowry into renovating the First Keep and making it habitable again. He got the idea from his father's plans of making the Starks, and the North, stronger. One of the things his father wanted to do was rebuild the broken tower, and Rob figured if they were going to one day repair the broken tower, why not fix up the First Keep as well? It was about half the size of the Great Keep, a few stories shorter but wider, and a lot older. Its stone walls were much smoother and weathered. It would allow them to host more guests within the castle walls, and even shelter more people during winters. He walked throughout its rooms and halls with Winifred. She was his wife and the future Lady of Winterfell, so having her at his side and getting her input on his idea seemed right. Trailing behind them as they walked was Jon Oz, the new steward, a leather-bound book and quill in his hand. Despite being abandoned, the rooms were still warm, which was surprising to Rob. They were not as warm as the rooms in the Great Keep, but he hadn't expected any warmth, and it was something he commented on. The piping must still be intact, Winifred said, resting her hand against the wall and feeling the warmth seeping through the stone. We should probably bring in an expert to check on it though, to be on the safe side. Jon Oz made note in the book he carried. He would jot down everything Rob and Winifred were saying in regards to repairs. The man wanted to make sure nothing was missed. We'll definitely need some stonemasons to repair the gaps and cracks, Rob said, peering through a large crack and seeing the broken tower outside. We'll need all new furniture, Winifred commented, as they entered another room with a rotted wood bed frame. Beds, wardrobes, trunks, desks, chairs. I want it all local, Rob added. We'll hire northern carpenters and stonemasons. No one from the south or Essos. Of course, John O said as he continued to write down what they told him. And what of the Lycoyard? Are you going to leave that outside one of the entrances? Rob looked at Winifred, who looked as unsure as he felt. To disturb the dead like that, even those who had been gone for hundreds of years, seemed wrong. Yet they could not have a burial ground outside one of the entrances like that. I cannot say at the moment, Rob confessed. While it makes sense to reclaim the courtyard for other purposes, I do not wish to dishonor the dead. Perhaps it would be best if I consult with others before making such a decision. By others he meant Maester Lewin and anyone who had deep knowledge of the old gods and their worship. It was said that any who disturbed the barrows in the Barrowlands would welcome a curse upon themselves. Was that all graves? Or was there something specific about the ones in the Barrowlands? Rob had no way of knowing either way. What he did know was that he didn't want to call a curse upon himself or his wife or anyone who would be doing the work for them. Of course, Lord. There was water damage starting on the second highest floor. The roof over the top floor had partially collapsed, letting in all of the rain and snow, and that had leaked to the rooms below. The top floor itself had mold and moss and mushrooms all growing within it. There would be a lot of work going into fixing up the first keep. I want to expand the glass gardens as well, Rob said, as they descended the stairs, after the tour of the first keep was over. The glass gardens provided food every year but were especially vital during winters. Expanding it, even if by only a few extra feet, would allow them to grow more crops, which meant they would be able to feed more people. One of the reasons the North's population was so small compared to its size was because a lack of food during long winters meant many starved to death. If Winterfell was capable of producing more of its own food during the cold winter months, that meant less food needed to be collected, and more food in the hands and stomachs of the local farmers. You'll need to look beyond the North for glass makers, I'm afraid, John O's pointed out. I do not believe that is a craft any Northerner can do. Probably not, Rob agreed. Micken can make the new frame, if he has the time. Otherwise we'll have to bring in another blacksmith. White Harbor has stonemasons, carpenters, and blacksmiths aplenty, Winifred said. I'm not sure about glass makers. John O's may be right, we might have to look beyond the North for that. Perhaps it would be best to bring in an expert to get an exact idea of time, labor, and materials both for fixing the first keep and expanding the gardens. That way you'll have a better idea of how much this is all going to cost. Rob found himself agreeing with John O's suggestion. Neither himself nor Winifred were stonemasons, carpenters, builders, or any other number of tradesmen that would have much more knowledge on what needed to be done. Good idea. Write a letter to White Harbor for someone who can oversee both projects and will know what is needed and who to hire. Of course, Lord. I'm sure my father or grandfather have someone they can recommend. I'll write them a letter and we can send our letters together, John O's. As Winifred and John O's discussed the letters they would send, Rob looked thoughtfully at the book John O's carried. Perhaps it would be wise to have his own book so he could jot down his ideas as they came to him. It was better than relying on his memory and always needing to recall everything. Winifred was full of ideas of her own, likely a result of her upbringing as second in line to White Harbor, after her father. Rob had been thinking of ways to improve the North ever since he first had that meeting with his own father during the king's arrival at Winterfell, ways that were different from those his father had already been acting on. It was something he and Winifred discussed every now and then, as he loved to get her thoughts on his ideas. Writing the ideas and their discussions over them in a book would make it much easier tracking everything. He would think on it. Chapter 13, Jon 4. Jon 4. Though he wished the man would stay longer, Tyrion Lannister only stayed for 2 nights at Winterfell after their arrival. Enough time for both men and horse to rest and catch their breaths. During that time, Jon had pulled from the shelves the ancient book written by the Maester who had served Lord Cregan Stark, who wrote in detail of Prince Jaehaerys Valyrian's visit to Winterfell on his dragon, Vermux. Now knowing Tyrion's love of dragons, Jon thought he would enjoy the read, as the Maester gave a detailed description of Vermux, and so lent the book to Tyrion. The man had been engrossed in the book and read the entire thing in the 2 nights before deciding to continue his journey south, back to the lands of his father, as soon as he finished reading the last page. "Are you sure you cannot stay another few days?" Jon asked, as Tyrion's men packed their satchels with the food the Starks were providing for them. It was not a large amount of food, but if rationed properly would be enough to last them until Moat Cailin, and from there they would be able to buy more. Robb and Lady Catelyn had already bid Tyrion goodbye a few moments before, and the servants who had brought the Lannister men food for their journey had done so under Robb's orders. That left Jon as the sole member of House Stark to see them out of Winterfell, as the one who had spent the most time in their presence. "I've been away from the brothels of the Westerlands for too long," Tyrion responded with a grin and a shake of his head. "The ones in Lannisport will go out of business if I don't return soon. I imagine due to my extended absence they had to let go of at least a few of the whores already." Tyrion must have noticed the disappointed look on Jon's face. "You know you can always join me. I can use a man of your intelligence and skill at my side." Jon laughed, pleased at the offer even if he would not accept it. "You mean someone to get you out of the trouble your mouth gets you into it? Well, I thought that was self-explanatory." They shook hands, the Stark bastard and the Lannister imp, a strange friendship neither expected. "Should you ever find yourself in the Westerlands, Jon Snow, stop by Castle Rock. I'd love to show you our sewer systems, some of the cleanest in the world, I assure you." Jon laughed. How could I say no to such an offer? Tyrion grinned at him before turning his horse and leading it through the King's Road gate. His small escort followed behind him. Jon sighed as the man departed. It was nice having someone around who could relate to him, being the outsider of a noble family for reasons outside of one's control. Tyrion had given him a lot of advice on how to handle the situation, at least internally. Jon would miss the man's words of wisdom and witty remarks. Ghost was in the Godswood with the other direwolves, where they normally were in the mornings. Robb was with Winifred and the new steward, Jon Oz, as they worked on Robb's new project, repairing the First Keep. He had no idea where Theon had gotten off to, not that he particularly cared for the Greyjoy heirs' company without Robb there to mediate. Sir Roderick was working in the yard with the new recruits, like he did every afternoon, but Jon did not feel like working on his sword work right now. Instead he wandered his way through the castle, making his way up to the second floor. He walked past the room they had their lessons with Maester Lewyn and to the room where the younger ladies like Arya had their lessons in ladylike activities with Septa Mordane. A room located near the September his father had built 16 years ago for Lady Catelyn, so the Septa did not have to travel far between her lessons and her prayers. Jon knocked on the door and waited a few seconds for a voice to bid him to enter. He pushed the door open and stuck his head inside the room, eyes taking in the faces of each of the ladies inside. "My apologies for interrupting, my lady," he said, settling his gaze on the Septa, "but Robb needs to see Arya." Septa Mordane frowned at him. She disliked him almost as much as Lady Catelyn did. Despite the numerous bastards throughout the Seven Kingdoms, both noble and common, him being a bastard was an affront to her religion, or something of the sort. He was fortunate the old gods did not hold bastards in such disdain. The feeling of being watched had his gaze shift to Jorel Mormont, who was staring at him with wide eyes and appeared as if she might faint. Jon wondered if he should call the Maester, but the girl quickly looked away with heated cheeks. "Arya, you may go." Arya did not need any more convincing. She dropped her needlework on the ground and, ignoring the protest from Septa Mordane at her unladylike behavior, all but ran to the door. Jon pushed it open for her, and as soon as she zipped by him, he closed it softly so as to not further aggravate the pious woman. He turned to look at his sister, who was bouncing on the balls of her feet. "What does Robb want?" "Nothing," Jon answered, quietly so as to not be overheard by those on the other side of the door. "But you said." "I lied." "Do you want to go back to your lesson?" "No." "Come on, I have something to give you." Arya was silent as she followed him. Knowing her like he did, he was sure she had tons of questions she wanted to ask, but she kept them to herself for now. He led them down a walkway that lined the courtyard, into the Great Keep, through a few corridors, and to his room, where he closed the door behind them. "Why did you lie? What do you want to show me? Does Robb know you are doing this? Does Mother?" Jon held up his hand to stop any more questions from coming. He reached underneath his bed and pulled out the sword Mikken had made for him, which was still wrapped in its cloth, and held it out for her. Her face was screwed up in confusion, but she took it and pulled off the cloth. She looked at the sheathed sword in wonder. "Is this for me?" she asked, looking at him. Jon nodded his head, a pleased smile on his face. Arya carefully took hold of the hilt and pulled the blade from its sheath. She examined the sword from every angle. It was exceptionally made, not that Jon believed Mikan would make anything less. It's so skinny. So are you. I had Mikan make this special. The Bravos use swords like this in Pentos and Myr and the other free cities. It won't hack a man's head off, but it can poke him full of holes if you're fast enough. She gave it a few experimental swings. Jon adjusted her grip, showing her the proper way to hold it. She didn't fight against his adjustments, and easily adapted to what he was trying to show her. She was already taking to sword training better than Samwell Tarly ever did. I've written to father, and Robb is working on your mother. We're hoping they'll let you train with it. Arya looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Do you really think they will? Jon wanted to tell her that he did think so, if only to keep his little sister happy, but he would not lie to her. Instead he shrugged his shoulders. If they do, one of the terms will be that you attend your other lessons without skipping them and without complaining about them. Arya's hopeful look turned into a scowl. Can't I at least skip the ones with Septum Ordain? Why do I need to know any of the things she teaches? He had expected her pushback against the idea and had spent some time thinking of how he would convince her the lessons were necessary. After battles there are a lot of wounded men. If anyone is cut open from a blade, to help heal the wound you need to sew the skin back together. Needlework might seem useless to you, but ask Mayor Stillowin and he will tell you how important it is for him to know it. She did not look like she entirely believed his answer. And what about all the stupid songs? Music has a lot of purposes. For instance, on campaign the men will sing to keep up morale. And I'm sure you've seen at all the feasts that people like to sing along and dance to songs because it lifts their spirits and puts them in a good mood. Any good commander knows to keep the morale of his troops up. You don't know these things. I don't know how to sew, Jon conceded, but I do know the words to a lot of songs. Besides, it does not matter. If you want to receive proper training with this sword, like Jarell has been receiving, then you must stick with your other lessons, all of them, just like she does. Your attendance of those lessons is the wish of father, and it is the wish of your mother. Otherwise, I'll take it back. She pulled the sword close to her in a possessive way and shook her head. I'll go to my lessons, I promise. Good, then here's your first lesson in sword fighting. Stick him with the pointy end. Arya rolled her eyes. I know that. She continued to swing it around, and Jon took a careful step backwards to put a bit more distance between them. Last thing he needed was to be accidentally skewered by an overeager 10-year-old. There would be no explaining that away. You know, all the great swords have names, like ice. What should I name it? She asked, stopping her swings to think of a name. I thought after your most favorite thing in the world. Her eyes scrunched in confusion before she saw the look on his face. Needle, they both said together. She sheathed the sword and wrapped it back in the cloth. Once done, she jumped onto Jon to hug him, squeezing him tight. Thank you so much. Don't thank me just yet, Jon said as he was released from the hug. Let's hope father is agreeable to training. If he isn't, then you'll have to train in secret and make sure no one besides Robb and I see you. She nodded her head, showing that she would take his words seriously, or at least as seriously as she had ever taken anything. Jon opened his door to see that Ghost and Nymeria both sat there in the corridor, as if acting as guards. The more time he spent around the direwolves, the more he was agreeable to Robb's theory that they were sent by the old gods. As he ate dinner the next day, Jon found himself lost in thought. They were approaching Robb's Name-a-Day, which meant they were approaching Jon's as well, not that Jon's was celebrated with the same enthusiasm that Robb's was. In another year or two, a decision would need to be made in regards to Jon's future. Would he go through with his wish to join the Night's Watch? That was a difficult question to answer. His father had wanted him to see what the Night's Watch was like before committing to it, and what he had seen had put a huge damper on his original dream of joining. Castle Black was falling apart, the organization was undersized, and most of those who were in it were criminals, many of them rapists and murderers. Few men of honor joined the Watch anymore. Could he truly see himself as a brother of the Night's Watch, sharing his meals with men who were only there because it was that or death? Or maybe he could take Lord Tyrion up on his offer and travel the south of Westeros at the Lannisters' side. If he acted as a companion and bodyguard to the man, he would likely never want of money, given how rich the Lannisters were. He'd also see places of Westeros he had only ever heard of by name, like Casterly Rock and King's Landing. Plus he doubted protecting Tyrion from those who took offense to the man's biting sarcasm came with the same danger of being a ranger of the Night's Watch, so it would be a safer route. There was also a third option he had never really considered. He remembered hearing his father talk about wanting to resettle some of the abandoned keeps throughout the north. Perhaps, if he wanted, Jon would be married to the second daughter of some minor house and given a keep of his own to call home. Out of the keeps he knew that sat empty, if he had his choice, he'd probably choose the White Tower, that sat along the western bank of the White Knife, several days north of White Harbor. The land around it was fertile. There was already a small population of common folk who lived in the area, and Lord Marndale was a more appealing liege lord than some of the others out there. Having a place to call his own, no matter where it was located or who he swore his allegiance to, would be a great honor. There was of course Moat Cailin, which, he had heard his father mention on several occasions, had been rebuilt and would likely have many more buildings and towers going up over the next few decades. Jon knew that with Robb being the future Lord of Winterfell, one of Robb's brothers was to be given lordship over Moat Cailin, to guard entry into the north and start a new cadet branch of House Stark. Jon also knew that brother was not going to be him. Lady Catelyn feared Jon would try to usurp his brother's claim and start a dance of the dragons in the north, which Jon imagined would be called a War of the Wolves by historians if such a thing ever happened. Not that it would, because even the thought of it was ridiculous. Jon loved all of his siblings, even Sansa, who kept him at arm's length because of her mother. He would never do anything to betray Robb or any of the others. Yet that fear of Lady Catelyn's, the one that had tormented Jon all his life, would ensure Moat Cailin would never be his because of the power the Lord of Moat Cailin had. That fear also meant that no matter what path he ended up walking down, the common theme was the same: regardless of what he chose to do with the rest of his life, it would not take place at Winterfell. Especially if his father was to be away in the south at King's Landing. His future was something he had often thought about, but now he found it quickly approaching. Soon it wouldn't be daydreaming of some distant day, it would very much be the present. He was brought from his thoughts by the arrival of Lady Catelyn, who had been noticeably absent for the start of the meal. She approached Robb at the table with a letter clutched in her hand. "I have received word from Riverrun. My father, your grandfather, is sick and there is fear he might not have much time left." "That is grave news," Robb said with a frown. Jon wondered if Robb remembered meeting Lord Hoster Tully. Jon never had, but he was not the man's grandson. The first time Robb would have met the man had been when they were 3, when Lady Catelyn had travelled down to Riverrun a few months after Sansa was born to bring her 2 children to meet their grandfather. Their father and Jon had stayed at Winterfell during that trip. Another time Lord Tully had visited Winterfell and Jon remembered being forced to eat with the servants in the kitchen for a few weeks as a small child because of the visit. Instead of lessons with Maester Lewyn and Sir Roderick, he had spent his time with Hullen out in the stables or being taken on a ride through the hills and woods that surrounded the castle without any of his other siblings or father joining. They had been maybe 8 at the time, as it was shortly after Bran had been born that the Lord Paramount of the Tident had made the trip up to the north with his own son, a teenage Ed Muir, in tow. "Your uncle Ed Muir is not sure how much time he has left. I must go to him in his final moments. Of course. I will leave for Riverrun tomorrow, and I will be taking Arya and Rickon with me." Jon looked at Arya, who must have been hearing this for the first time as well, and had an outraged look on her face. No doubt she was thinking how hard it would be to train with her new sword when she would spend a few weeks traveling with her mother, then being at Riverrun, a castle totally unknown to her, and then traveling back to Winterfell. It would likely be a couple of months before she would be able to train with it without getting caught. Jon knew she didn't have that kind of self-control or patience. While Jon had spent so much time thinking of his future, it looked like Robb was going to get a brief taste of his own future, the one where he was the Lord of Winterfell, his wife was the Lady of Winterfell, and neither his parents nor his natural-born siblings would be there for comfort or support. Outside of the day-to-day running of the North, Jon only knew of one thing of importance coming up that Robb would have to handle without his mother being around offering advice: the completion of the Wolf's Road. Though if she was gone long enough, 5 to 6 months, Another important thing to handle would be the upcoming harvest feast. It might not seem like so as children, but the harvest feast was one of the most politically significant events in the north. The expectation was that at least a dozen lords would be making the trip to Winterfell for the feast, and a lord does not cross 100 leagues for a lavish feast and a cup of wine. Only those who had matters they considered important would make the trip to stand before the Stark in Winterfell to discuss such matters. Robb would be expected to listen to the bannermen carefully and then make decisions that could significantly impact the north. The next morning Jon leaned against the frame of Arya's door and watched as she packed, or rather repacked, as Septa Mordane found her folding skills abysmal. Laying on the floor also watching Arya repack was Nymeria. "It would be smart to leave Needle here," he said. "It's going to be hard to slip away to train, and you're just going to increase the chance of being caught with it." Arya continued her packing and refused to look at him. Nymeria let out a soft whine and turned her head and looked at the wall, as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. Jon sighed. "You already packed it, didn't you?" Arya bit her bottom lip. "It's at the bottom of my trunk." Jon pinched the bridge of his moment for a moment in frustration. "If you get caught, at least send me a warning so I can be gone from Winterfell before your mother gets back here to kill me." "I won't get caught," she said, sticking her chin out in defiance. Jon did not remember having this much defiance and confidence when he was Arya's age. "We'll see." He said his goodbyes to Arya and Rickon in their rooms, away from Lady Catelyn, and then watched from one of the walkways as Robb did the same in the courtyard in front of the King's Road gate. With the goodbyes all said, the retinue left. 8 men rode in front, one of whom carried the Stark banner, followed by Lady Catelyn and Arya on horse. Behind them was a wagon pulled by a pair of horses that was full of supplies, Rickon, and a pair of servants. Bringing up the rear of the small column were 16 men, split into 2 columns of 8. Walking along the side of the group, until they got out into the open space and had more freedom to run around, were Shadowdog and Nymeria. "Jon." He looked down at Robb, who stared up at him. "Come to Father's Solar." Jon nodded. There were faster ways to get to the Solar from where he was, but he stuck to the walkways that surrounded the courtyards. Entering the Solar he found Robb, Theon, Maester Luwin, and Sir Rodrik all inside. "With my mother gone for the next several months, Theon and Jon are going to join me in these meetings," Robb said. Maester Luwin gave both Jon and Theon a small smile, while Sir Rodrik gave a curt nod of understanding. Theon attending the meetings made some sense. He was the heir to the Iron Islands, so running a realm, even one that was so much smaller than the North, was something he would eventually be doing. Jon would be lucky to get 20 acres of land to be in charge of. "Sir Rodrik, how goes the training of the new guard recruits?" "My mother has taken 24 men with her, so we now find ourselves with only 76 trained guards." "Months away," Sir Rodrik murmured. "Some show promise and I might consider them worthy quicker, but it will take a while before I can get them to where they need to be." "I can help," Jon said, leaning forward. Every pair of eyes shifted to Jon, most of them in surprise. "We barely have enough house guards for normal duties, so you can't pull many to help with training." "I have some experience in training recruits." He left out the part that the experience was barely a week, "and I've reached my end with lessons." Here Jon looked at Maester Luwin, who gave a slow nod. "You have learned much of what I can teach. Give me the best of them, or the worst of them, and I'll work with them from morning until supper," Jon promised. "It's your call, Sir Rodrik," Robb said after a moment of silence. Sir Rodrik pulled on the great white whiskers that lined his face, his mouth a grim line. "Very well, Jon. Just remember that being a good swordsman doesn't mean you are a good teacher. I will give you the 7 worst recruits, all of whom are older than you." The last part was said more as a warning, as it might be difficult getting someone who was older to listen to a 15-year-old, but Jon was confident he could do it. He might not know what he would be doing a year from now, but he knew what he would be doing over the next couple of months. "I will make proper guards out of them," Jon vowed, looking first Sir Rodrik in the eyes and then Robb. They both gave him a nod, putting their faith in him. He would not let either of them down. Chapter 14, Ned v. Ned v. Gather men. Ned shouted down to the guards who stood in the courtyard below, looking around in confusion and shock. "We must fight the blaze before it consumes the city. Samandon, run to the rookery." We must send ravens to every nearby keep to send men and their maesters as soon as possible. Go. The 2 members of the King's Guard ran off to do as told. Members of the Gold Cloaks and Ned's own guard were slower to react. The king was still staring at the green flames in shock. Robert. Robert shook his head, as if coming from a daze, and a resolute look overtook his face. He marched down the stairs, with Ned and a still stunned Sir Jaime following behind him. "Get me every shovel and bucket in this damn city!" Robert shouted. "You, get the river gate open. I want you 3 to gather as many people as possible and get a bucket brigade going. Move, damn it!" Those still around them rushed to do as told, including those Robert had pointed at specifically. Several of Ned's men moved to join them, to act as an escort as Robert led them out of the Red Keep and into the city proper. It was pure disorder as the common folk ran to escape the flames, knocking each other over in the process. Ned saw a gold cloak captain doing his best to organize things, but he was a speck of gold in a sea of chaos. He approached the captain, shouldering through the people to do so. "Where is Commander Slynt?" Ned demanded. Surely the man should have been here in the chaos, unless he perished in the flames. He ran, sir, the captain admitted. He tried to corral the masses, but as soon as he saw the wildfire he turned tail and ran. On top of all the other charges Ned had against Janos Slynt, he could now add cowardice to the list as well. Once this whole mess was over with, he'd be meeting with Robert and Renly to get the gold cloaks sorted out. Spread the word to the rest of the gold cloaks. Open the gates and direct the people out of the city. Better they panic outside the walls than in. Any common folk brave enough to stay and help should report to the river gate to form a bucket brigade. Any spare gold cloaks should report here to help battle the fires. The captain nodded and went to spread the word. Ned turned back to see Robert and most of those that followed had already moved to the fire to help fight it. Harwin and Jory, 2 of the men who had escorted them from the Red Keep, had stayed with Ned. "What now, Lord?" Jory asked, as they moved to join the rest. "Now we get the king the hell away from the fire." "What is he thinking?" Robert wouldn't budge. He was a man of action and had done nothing but sit on his ass the past 9 years. These were the moments he lived for, and Ned couldn't change his mind. "We need to create a fire break." The men from the north nodded in understanding, but Robert and Sir Jaime just looked at him in confusion. It was a never-before occurrence for either of them to participate in firefighting duties, that was left to the common folk. Yet things were different in the north, where the vast size and sparse population meant that if a fire broke out in the Wolfswood near Winterfell, Ned helped put it out because every man was needed. When there's a forest fire that cannot be controlled, the only way to stop it is to move ahead of it and remove all potential kindling in its path, and let it burn out where it stands. While some men fight this fire, others need to move ahead of it and start demolishing and removing the wooden structures in its path. When Ned trudged into the Tower of the Hand later that night, after over 12 hours of fighting the fire with thousands of others, the fire was still raging in the city below, but it was relatively contained. At least that was the hope. With a fury, hundreds of men had set on the nearby houses and shops, tearing at them with axes and hammers, dismantling them and carrying the wood far away. At the same time, thousands more shoveled dirt or worked to get buckets of water from the black water rush to pour on the flames. Buildings still burned, but there were fewer of them. Several hundred men stayed behind to make sure the fire stayed contained. They would take stock of the damage tomorrow, and try their best to identify all those who had died. They would also need to figure out what to do with all the common folk who were now homeless. He had wanted to lower the population and rebuild the dragon pit, but not like this. Ned took a quick bath in lukewarm water to wash off the grime and the smell of smoke that clung to his skin. He gave his clothes to a servant to throw out. By the time he got back to his rooms, wrapped tightly in a robe, he wanted nothing more than to sleep for the next 3 days straight. But sitting on his bed, faces filled with worry, were Bran and Sansa with their direwolves at their feet. The hour was late and both should have been in bed long ago, but their fear and worry must have kept them up. "Father!" Sansa cried, running into his arms. "We were terrified something had happened to you." "I'm fine, but many in the city are not." "What happened?" Bran asked, standing from the bed. Ned remembered seeing Sir Robar with a shovel in his hand, helping to fight the fire. Bran must have wisely been left behind and had sought comfort with his sister. I don't know, son. Tomorrow will be a day for answers, but right now it is late. You should both be in bed. We wanted to make sure you were okay, Sansa explained. Ned kissed the top of his daughter's head and gave them both a tired smile. And I am grateful. He ushered both the children to his bedroom door. It would be best to not go on the morning walk for the next few days. Lady and Summer will have to make do with the Godswood. Every morning since arriving in King's Landing, no matter if it was sunshine or rain, the direwolves would be escorted to the Kingswood for a few hours to stretch their legs and hunt. Oftentimes Sansa would accompany them after her morning lessons, and sometimes Bran would as well when he got permission from Sir Robert. Even though it had been the northwestern section of the city that had burned, opposite of the river gate that led to the Kingswood, there was no telling how safe the streets would be to travel. Desperate people could do desperate things. Yes, father, they both answered. Good. Now off to bed. The next morning he rose later than normal and had a small breakfast in his room by himself. He was informed that both his children and their direwolves were in the Godswood, under the watchful eye of Harwin and a few other of his men. The king was in the throne room, where Ned found him sitting on the Iron Throne as members of the Gold Cloaks informed him that the last of the flames had died out over the night, but there were still embers that burned hot and could potentially start the fire anew if they were not careful. There were men who were doing their best to quench the heat of the embers so they could begin the process of clearing out the rubble. Tents had been set up outside the city walls for the wounded, where Maestas and others worked on them the best they could. Ned had seen the wounds from fire before. He had seen skin sliding off flesh due to untrained hands. It was not a sight he wished to see again. Other tents were being set up to house the homeless, though they feared they did not have enough tents to house them all. Ned would try to see if any of the local lords could take some of them in, at least temporarily. Robert for his part looked tired but somehow more alive than Ned had ever seen since the king had first come to Winterfell. During the small breaks between each man relaying what information they had, the king would turn to Sir Barristan, who stood dutifully at his side, and regale the white-haired knight with snippets of the fight against the fire. Despite his aching muscles, Ned stood and waited for everyone else to have their turn. It was over an hour before it was just Ned, the king, Sir Barristan, and the guards who lined the walls. "Ned, you look like shit," Robert boomed as Ned stepped forward. "Thank you, Your Grace," Ned replied with a tired grin. "Most of the aftermath is being handled. Though we'll need to bring in supplies and workers once everything is cleared to rebuild." Ned nodded at Robert's words. "That is all well and good, but right now I think it is best we try to get to the bottom of the explosion." Robert leaned forward on the throne, his face curious. "You know something?" Ned shook his head. "I don't, but I believe Sir Jaime does." Both Robert's and Sir Barristan's eyebrows rose upon his declaration. "Careful with your words, Ned," Robert warned. "Or one might mistake them as an accusation." "Not an accusation, not yet." "But did you see Sir Jaime's face after the explosion happened? Like he had seen a ghost from his past." "Where is Sir Jaime?" "Guarding the Queen," Sir Barristan answered. "Summon him," Robert ordered. "And let us see what secrets the Kingslayer holds." Ned had a chair brought into the throne room while they waited for some gold cloaks to get the man. He was too tired and sore to remain standing any longer. With silence needing to be filled, Robert launched into full details of last night. He enthused about it the same way he did when recalling one of the battles he had fought in. Sir Jaime strode into the room half an hour later, and Ned took note that he lacked the usual swagger in his step. Like Ned and the king, Sir Jaime looked tired with dark bags under his eyes. "You summoned me, Your Grace?" Sir Jaime asked, bowing. "What do you know about the wildfires?" Robert demanded. "Your Grace, the wild, I don't know anything." Ned didn't just hear the hesitation in Sir Jaime's words, he saw it in his actions. "You do," Ned said. "I saw the look on your face after the explosion." "What do you know of it? Who put the wildfire there?" Sir Jaime bowed his head and stood still for several moments. Ned thought he wasn't going to say anything. Robert let out a grunt of frustration. "Answer the damn. The Mad King." It was said quietly and all three of them leaned forward to see if they heard right when it was repeated. "The Mad King put the wildfire there." Ned looked at Sir Barristan, who was also a part of the court at that time, but he looked more confused than anything. How could Sir Jaime, who was the youngest and newest member of the King's Guard at the time, know more than one of its senior members? Tell it all. And so Sir Jaime did. How the Mad King, fearing the rebels, had the pyromancers make hundreds of pots of wildfire, and stored them underneath the important areas of King's Landing, the Red Keep, the Great September of Baelor, the Dragon Pit, and each of the gates through the outer walls. How the plan was to ignite the caches and burn the city, and everyone in it to the ground to prevent Robert from claiming it. Half the King's Guard had been with Rhaegar at the Trident, and the other half had disappeared in Dorne under the orders of the prince, which left only one of their order in King's Landing. That had been the reason, Sir Jaime said, he had stabbed the king in the back and earned his nickname of Kingslayer. He told of how afterwards he had hunted down anyone else who knew of the plot and killed them too, leaving him the only one left who knew of the cache's existence. Ned felt his head spinning for a multitude of reasons. Below his feet was wildfire that had been sitting for 15 years, slowly turning into an even more volatile mixture. He had allowed his children to live here with such a threat under them this entire time. And then there was his disdain of the man called Kingslayer, for his breaking of his oath, when the apparent reason for breaking said oath was to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Truly a noble purpose, but in keeping the secret he had allowed thousands to die. Ned was no stranger to keeping secrets. He just hoped his own didn't lead to so much death and destruction. They discovered 200 jars of wildfire under the Great September last year, Sir Barristan recalled. No one knew how they got there. Sir Barristan, go to the Alchemist Guild. We need every pyromancer available scouring the cellars, tunnels, and catacombs of this city and safely removing the wildfire so it can be properly disposed of. Tell them to start at the Iron Gate, the Dragon Gate, and the Old Gate. Once those are done, we will evacuate the Red Keep and they can search under here. Of course, Your Grace. Sir Barristan bowed low and hurried from the room. Sir Jaime, Robert said, turning back to his good brother, his voice booming, for 15 years you have been despised and mocked for what should be your greatest achievement. Yet despite that, here we stand dealing with the consequences of your ignorance. Robert sighed heavily. He sounded more like a king now than at any other point Ned had known him. Thousands are dead and hundreds more will be crippled because you kept the secret of this wildfire to yourself, having no idea how dangerous a secret you kept. And as my hard-headed brother is fond of saying, a good act does not wash out the bad, nor a bad act the good. Each should have its own reward. As punishment for your silence, you will be temporarily removed from your post. Your cloak and armor and sword will stay here, and you will be in Flea Bottom, helping to clear away the rubble and helping to rebuild what was lost. Sir Jaime looked stunned. He opened his mouth to protest, but then he did something Ned had never seen before. Jaime Lannister closed his mouth without a word. Instead he took off his cloak and let it flutter to the floor behind him. Next he undid the belt around his waist, the one that held his sword, and let it fall. Then he turned on his heel and marched from the room without a backward look. 2 days later and Ned again found himself in the throne room, though this time instead of Sir Barristan and Sir Jaime, he and the king were joined by Renly with Sir Mandon Moore standing vigil next to the king. The pots of wildfire under the Red Keep, and each of the gates, had been discovered and removed by the alchemist without issue. Though small groups still moved through the catacombs of the city to make sure every single pot had been discovered and removed. Ned wondered if they would be able to find every pot placed, as it was a maze down there with more twists and turns than anyone alive knew. The king was already in a bad mood because the tourney of the hand, which was going to be held in 10 days' time, almost 5 weeks after Ned's arrival in King's Landing, had to be cancelled. Logically, the king knew they couldn't hold the tourney anymore, but that did not mean the man had to be happy about it. And Ned was making the king's mood worse. He held up stacks of parchment that he clutched in his hand and waved about as he talked. Hundreds of allegations of being drunk on the job, extortion, bribery, assault, rape, murder, and dozens of other crimes. And it isn't just the bottom-tier men of the Gold Cloaks, it's the captains and even the Lord Commander himself. Who, I now know due to him running the Night of the Fire, is also a coward. How could you let the Gold Cloaks sink so low? Renly grimaced under Ned's glare, the usual smile on his face falling away. Janos Slynt is corrupt, Renly agreed, not bothering to offer any defense. I have done my best to counter him, but he is much more influential with the gold cloaks than I. Jon Arryn wanted to remove him from his post a few years ago, but, well, it did not happen. Ned didn't need to see Renly casting a furtive glance to Robert to know it was the king who had kept Janos on as Lord Commander of the Gold Cloaks. Baelish argued to keep him, Robert said, defending himself before Ned could levy any accusations. Ned had no doubt who Janos Slyn's true master was. And I figured better the stranger you know, than the one you do not. There was Robert's preference for doing nothing over doing something. When it came to fighting a fire he was a man of action, but when it came to ruling the realm he could not be bothered. Rather than go after Robert for being a lazy and poor ruler, which he knew would just make the man angrier and more defensive, Ned decided to just move forward with solving the problem in front of him. This cannot keep up. These men deserve punishment. The city festers with crime, and half of it is perpetrated by those tasked with keeping it safe. I should be out hunting, or out there with my face buried in a pair of tits. Robert rubbed his face. Out with it then, Ned, what do you propose? Janos Slyn should be executed. For multiple reasons, but this was his second chance and he screwed it up. Most of the rest of the men should be sent to the wall. Some should be kicked out of the Gold Cloaks and banished from the city. The rest of the infractions are minor enough where we can let them slide with a warning. Fine, agreed the king murmured. Ned wondered if his friend regretted dragging him out of the north to be his hand yet. Do you have names? Renly asked. Ned handed the stack of parchments over to Renly. Each one held the name of a man and then a list of the crimes he was alleged to have committed. These accusations were backed up by multiple witnesses, including some of Ned's own men who had seen the behavior firsthand. These are very thorough, Renly stated as he shuffled through the pieces of parchment. I will take my personal guards and start rounding them up. If that is all, you are both dismissed. Ned and Renly both bowed low before walking from the room. Renly had a group of Baratheon men waiting outside the throne room, who he immediately started issuing orders to. Ned had his own group of Stark men, who would be accompanying him outside of the city. However, before they could leave the corridor outside the throne room, Ned was approached by Jory, who held a folded-up piece of parchment in his hand. Letter from Winterfell, Lord Stark, Jory said, holding out the piece of parchment. Ned took and opened it, and recognized Jon's handwriting. The boy was likely back from Castle Black and was reporting on what Ned had asked for him to keep an ear out for. The letter said that Tyrion Lannister made no mention of the king, the previous hand or anyone at court besides his siblings, his sister who he disliked and his brother who he loved. That was disappointing to Ned, as he hoped to gain even the slightest of hints into what role the Lannisters had in the death of Jon Arryn. The letter then continued with something that made Ned's eyebrows go up. Jon had given Arya a sword, a Bravo sword, and was requesting permission for her to receive training. Jon listed his arguments in 3 points, one after the other. Jorel Mormont being able to train at Winterfell while Arya, who was a Stark, could not, was insulting. By allowing Arya to be trained with a sword on the promise that she would attend her other lessons, it ensured she would never skip another lesson. They had all witnessed Arya stealing training swords and practicing on her own enough to know she would likely keep doing it in secret, where her chances of hurting herself increased. Ned found he could not really argue against anything Jon said, especially now that Arya had been given a sword of her own. Cat would not like it, he knew that, but he could convince his wife. Although he would have to make it seem like it was his own idea, lest Jon suffer the fallback. And if his little girl was going to learn to fight with such a small sword, she would need to be taught by someone who knew how to wield it, which he knew was not Sir Rodrik. Jory, search what remains standing of the city and see if you can't find me a Bravo. A Bravo, Lord? Jory asked, brows furrowed. A swordsman from the Free Cities, Ned explained. They use small and thin swords to fight. You should be able to identify them by their colorful outfits and their accents. I'll see what I can find. Jory walked off, scratching at the back of his head and likely wondering where he was going to find a Bravo. Ned beckoned the rest of his guard, and led them from the Red Keep. Their journey was through the Iron Gate and to the refugee camp set up outside the walls of the city. The entirety of Flea Bottom had burned to the ground, as had most of the buildings that surrounded Rhaenys Hill. The hill which had once towered 40 feet in the air was now maybe 10 feet at most. Many buildings that had been spared by the fire were still damaged from falling stone and wood from the initial explosion. The entire area, almost a third of the city, would need to be rebuilt. They would need to bring in architects to draw up plans. Given how quickly the rubble was being cleared away, they would need to have them brought in soon. Outside the city gates hundreds of tents had been erected. There were still moans coming from the ones housing the wounded. The maesters from houses Rosby, Stokeworth, Hayford, and Brindle had all come to lend their assistance to the few maesters who lived in the city itself. A group of gold cloaks surrounded 53 boys, ranging from the age of 10 to 18. These boys had been made orphans by the fire, and were only a part of the 300 to 400 children who shared similar fates, but the others were either too young or the wrong gender. "Is this all of them?" Ned asked the closest gold cloak. "All those who remained either inside or outside the city." Ned nodded and stepped closer to the boys. "I am Lord Eddard Stark, Hand of the King. What has happened is terrible, and I am truly sorry you are suffering through this. Most of you are probably wondering what are you to do now, with no home or support. I come before you with an offer. The Night's Watch needs men. It is a lifelong commitment to a hard life in the cold of the north, but as a man of the Night's Watch you will be given food, shelter, and most important of all, a purpose." The boys stared at him silently, some sullen, some with anger, and others with empty eyes. It was cruel of him to ask this of them now, when most of them were still reeling from the deaths of their parents and other family members. Yet no matter how crass it was, he had a reason. Once they rounded up the gold cloaks who would be sent to the Watch for their crimes, they would be sending a ship up to Eastwatch by the sea. Prudency said if they were going to send 2 different groups up to the Night's Watch, it would be smarter and cheaper to send them all in one go. And given how much they were going to have to pay to rebuild the city, they needed to save all the money they could. "There will be a ship leaving for the Night's Watch in a few days' time. Any of you who wish to take the black, tell one of the gold cloaks and they will take you to the Tower of the Hand, where you will be sheltered and fed until the boat leaves." 5 of the boys agreed to join the Watch then and there. Most likely, they were the ones who truly had no family left and saw no other options. The others might have siblings or some other non-parental family member they would want to talk with first, if taking the black was something they were seriously thinking of. They had a decision to make and he would give them a few days to make it. On the 7th day after the fire, Ned watched from the docks as the large merchant ship heading to Eastwatch by the sea set off with 19 orphans and 83 former gold cloaks. He had also given the ship crates of goods to bring to the Night's Watch as well, 4 of them filled with boots, cloaks, leather armor, socks, tunics, and underclothes, all of which had been dyed black. Each of the former gold cloaks had been allowed to bring their swords with them, though those would be kept separate in their own crate until they were sworn brothers of the Watch. There were a handful of architects waiting for Ned in his solar that he had to meet with. He had some ideas on what he wanted to build in the now much larger area that needed to be rebuilt, and he was going to see if these architects could work his ideas into their plans. However, there was something he needed to do first. He needed to take the head of Janos Slynt. Robert had offered the services of Eileen Payne for the job, as the king's executioner, but Ned was of the first men, and for the first men the one who passes the sentence should perform the execution, otherwise they become unfamiliar with death. It was at a time like this that he wished he had ice with him. Nothing cut quite as clean as Valyrian steel. He would have to make do with his steel greatsword and hoped for Janos Slynt's sake that it cut cleanly. "Lord Stark! Lord Stark!" The men who escorted him moved to surround him for protection, their silver armor gleaming in the sunlight, until they realized the person running at them was one of their own. The man Ned's children called Fat Tom came to a stop in front of him, huffing and puffing. "Tomard, what brings you out to the docks?" "A letter from Lady Caitlin," Lord Tomard gasped out, holding out his hand. "I did not think should wait." Ned took the letter and indeed was able to recognize his wife's handwriting. He opened the letter and saw the news: his good father was sick and likely would not make it beyond another few turns of the moon. Kat was traveling to Riverrun to see her father, and she was bringing Arya and Rickon with her. Riverrun was half the distance from King's Landing that Winterfell was. There was no way he could leave King's Landing now, but in 8 weeks' time when his wife arrived at her ancestral home, who knew what the state of the city would be? Perhaps he could convince the king to let him make the trip. But that conversation would have to wait. First, he had to take a man's head. Chapter 15, Bran. Bran. In his travels with Sir Robar, Bran had seen many castles, keeps, and cities, a few of which had inspired awe in him. The Eyrie was higher up than he could see, with multiple fortifications protecting its only entryway. King's Landing was an immense urban sprawl that had more people in one area than he had even thought existed in the whole world. Still, in all his travels nothing he saw compared to the sight of Winterfell. There was something about his home that inspired an awe in him that nothing could shake. Until he got his first view of Highgarden, that is. It was located on a broad verdant hill overlooking a river called the Marndale, which Bran knew from his lessons was where House Marndale got their name from back when they ruled over land in the Reach. The castle was surrounded by 3 rings of white stone whose crenellated curtain walls increase in height. The oldest towers, squat and square, dated from the Age of Heroes, back when the wall was first built. Newer towers were tall and slender, round fortifications built in the years after the Andal invasion. The castle's structures were covered in ivy, grapes, and climbing roses. And outside its walls there were fields of golden roses that stretched as far as the eye could see. Within Highgarden's walls were groves, fountains, and courtyards. Almost every space was filled with flowers, singers, pipers, fiddlers and harpers. The godswood contained 3 weirwoods, large, ancient, and graceful, that had grown so entangled over time that they looked like one single tree. It was here that Bran found himself, kneeling by the deep pool of water that lay under the massive shade of the weirwoods with summer by his side. He had come to pray to the old gods, as he tried to do often in keeping with the wishes of his father. Yet despite the relative silence in the godswood, compared to the rest of the castle, he found it hard to remain in prayer. He kept getting lost in his thoughts. With the tourney in King's Landing being cancelled, Sir Robar had no reason to stay in the capital, and after the explosion and desolation, had wanted to leave the city as quickly as possible. The same day Bran had been informed of his grandfather's illness was the same day he had accompanied Sir Robar as they left the city. That had been 6 months ago. They had travelled to other places, to participate in other tourneys being held in the realm. There was the one at Pink Maiden hosted by House Piper. Then the one at Crickehall Castle, hosted by House Crickehall. Sir Robar did well in the melees in each of those tourneys, coming in 2nd at Pink Maiden and 3rd at Crickehall, though he did not fare as well in the joust. Yet, Sir Robar was displeased with his competition at each of them. The tourney at King's Landing was going to bring in the best knights the land had to offer, and many had been en route to the city when word had spread of the explosion at the Dragon Pit and subsequent cancellation of the tourney of the Hand. Then the Tyrells had announced that they would be holding a tourney, and if anyone was going to put on one that would rival the one at King's Landing, it would be the Tyrells, who loved to show off their wealth. When the news had reached Sir Robar and Bran, they had left Crickehall Castle 10 days earlier and had been travelling north along the ocean road, almost at Lannisport. Sir Robar had ordered them to turn around at once, to head back south to Highgarden. It had taken 3 weeks for them to arrive at the seat of House Tyrell. Because of who they were, the second sons of powerful lords, they were given rooms and invited to feasts with the family. Bran himself didn't have much interaction with the members of the main Tyrell branch, as even though he was a Stark he was still only 9 years old and none were of age with him, though he was closer to his 10th name a day than he was to his 9th, not that him telling anyone that changed their mind. Instead he spent most of his time in the company of the squires and other pages who were accompanying the various knights and lords that were making their way to Highgarden. Like the others he watched as those knights and lords practiced fighting in the yard, testing each other to see who would be a worthy opponent in the tourney. To Bran's eyes there was no doubt who would be the winner of the melee if they decided to enter: Sir Garland Tyrell, second son of Lord Mace Tyrell. Few of the others seemed to match Sir Garland in skill with a blade, and sometimes the knight would take on 2, or even 3, opponents at once. If Sir Robar wanted to pit himself against the best Westeros had to offer, he had found it. He's very handsome. Bran turned with a start and saw Margaery Tyrell standing there. She wore a type of southern dress that showed more skin than anything any northern woman would wear. The few times Bran had seen Margaery he thought she was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, and could not help but blush in her presence. Today was no different. For once, she was not surrounded by a half-dozen ladies-in-waiting, who were mostly younger cousins. She had her hands clasped in front of her as she gazed at Summer, who lay lazily next to Bran. It had taken a lot of arguing to get the Tyrell guards to allow Summer into the castle. Already the direwolf was at Bran's shoulders and probably 60 pounds heavier. It was only through Sir Robar's interference that they did not try to kill Summer on sight, not that the direwolf would have allowed something like that to happen. "Thank you," Bran said, and then added as an afterthought, "my lady." She smiled at him, as if he was something cute to look upon. She went to take a step forward, toward him, but hesitated as she continued to look at Summer. "He will not hurt you," Bran said, as if reading her mind. "If he thought you a threat he would have already let you know he did not want you around." "That is reassuring, I think." Margaery took small steps forward, never taking her eyes off the direwolf. Bran thought she was either brave, coming in here by herself, or very stupid. He had yet to decide which. She eventually got close enough, and since Summer made no move to bite her, reached out a hand and began to scratch him behind his ear. Summer closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. Bran smiled at the sight. Few people were brave enough to allow any part of their body near enough to Summer to pet him, and he knew his direwolf was a fan of being pet, at least as long as he had a full stomach. "Is it true all of your siblings have direwolves too?" Margaery asked, eyes still on Summer. "Yes, even my natural-born brother Jon does." "And the wolves are all as well behaved as yours?" "Mostly. When I last saw them, my brother Rickon was too young to properly control his, and I doubt that has changed." "Truly, your family must have the blessings of the gods." "That's what my father thinks." "Blessed by the old gods, that is." "Ah yes, I forgot your family prays to the old gods." "How silly it all seems, praying to a tree." Bran did not say anything because he didn't know what to say in response. To him it seemed silly that she prayed to 7 different gods who were all supposed to be the same god, but he felt that would be a rude thing to say to one of his hosts. That was also the god of his mother and oldest sister, so voicing such a thing out loud seemed like an insult to them as well. Margaery stayed a little while longer, asking Bran questions about himself and his siblings. For whatever reason she seemed particularly interested in any betrothals they might have, but outside of Robb being married to Winifred and Sansa being betrothed to Brynden Blackwood, Bran did not think there were any. Perhaps this was all part of that gossip he had heard Sansa saying southern ladies liked to partake in. She left soon after, and Bran realized he had to get back to Sir Robar, to perform his duties as a page. The knight had gone on a hunt that Bran had been considered too young to accompany them on, but the hunting party should be arriving back at any moment. "Stay here, Summer. I'll be back later with dinner." The direwolf tilted his head before letting out a harumph and rolling onto his side. Bran knew Summer understood him. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. Bran waited in the courtyard by the main gate with other pages and servants. He found he got along best with Walter Frey, who he was of age with and was the page for Lord Raymond d'Arry, head of House d'Arry and a knight from the Riverlands. Bran thought having 5 siblings was a lot. Walter said that he had 21 brothers, 7 sisters, and more cousins, nieces, and nephews than he could count, and that did not even include all the bastard ones. Bran was astounded to hear that Walter's oldest brother was older than Bran's grandfather, Lord Hoster Tully. He listened in fascination as Walter described growing up in the overcrowded Twins, where all his older male relatives jockeyed for the favor of Lord Walder, hoping he would inexplicably renounce his heir, Stevron, and declare one of them the heir to the Twins instead. The younger of Lord Frey's sons, like Perwyn and Oliver, did their best to stay out of the infighting, and Walter was looking to follow their lead. Then the hunting party returned with several deer carcasses thrown over the backs of horses. Bran attended to Sir Robar, bringing the knight's horse to the stable and making sure he was fed and secured. When that was done he went to the rooms that had been given to them, to see Sir Robar had stripped himself of his outer clothes and was observing one of the many amazing views of Highgarden. The knight glanced over his shoulder at Bran's entrance before turning back to the window. "Tell me, Bran, and speak true, do you think I have a chance of winning the melee?" "I do, my lord," Bran answered after a moment's hesitation. "It took you a moment to think on it," Sir Robar pointed out, turning to look at him. "I asked you to speak true." "Well, I do as long as Sir Garland is not in the melee." Sir Robar chuckled. "Ah, yes, I see. Sir Garland is very skilled with a sword. One of the best I've ever seen, though I was too young to see Sir Arthur Dane wield his mighty sword. I would pay good coin to see Sir Garland go up against Sir Jaime Lannister or Sir Barristan the Bold. Bran had seen both those men in the training yards of King's Landing while they were there. The two had never gone against each other, so Bran could not claim which one was the better of them. He suspected Sir Jaime, but only because of the age difference. He was sure if Sir Barristan was still young, he'd win easily. How Sir Garland would fare against either he could not even begin to guess, though his mind could conjure up images of what such an epic fight might look like. Later that night Bran had a strange dream. He was in a forest of dark and twisted trees that seemed to stretch to the stars themselves. There was snow on the ground. Not soft snow that had freshly fallen, but hard snow that was packed together after hours and days of sitting on the ground and could hold the weight of a man. He was dressed as he was for his first dinner back at Winterfell, when the king had visited the north all those months ago, a grey doublet that had the stark direwolf running across his heart, matching grey breeches with dark boots and a white cloak lined with grey that hung from his shoulders. Despite his clothing, he felt a chill run up his spine, and he knew that he was farther north than Winterfell, maybe even farther north than the Wall. There was a deeper sense of foreboding in these woods that the Wolfswood did not have. There was something beyond his sight, through the trees. Despite his inability to see it, he could sense it. His dream self moved forward through the trees for what felt like hours. Branches and thorns from the underbrush caught on his clothes, tearing holes in the rich fabric. He walked until he came upon the oddest sight. Sticking out of the ground, its skin as pale as milk, was a giant hand clenched in a fist. Resting on the fist was more crows than he had ever seen before. The rookery at Winterfell, filled with the larger ravens, was not as packed as this fist was. There were easily over 100 of the black birds. In fact, there were too many to count, but something in his gut told him there were 300 crows in front of him. Out of nowhere, a silent avalanche of snow and ice crashed onto the fist, sweeping the crows into its frozen grip. They flapped their wings and caught in panic as they attempted to flee, but one by one, they were swallowed by the rising snow. As the ice buried the fist completely, their cries faded and left nothing but silence. The avalanche had appeared, swept up the crows, and buried the fist in less than a minute. Dream Bran stood rooted to the spot, unable to move as he watched what unfolded in front of him. He worried he too would be swept away by the avalanche, but it never came in his direction. When everything was left still and quiet, he found he could move again. So he took a step forward, only to see a crow's head pop out of the snow and look at him. But something was wrong, because crows did not have icy blue eyes like that. More of the crows dug themselves from the snow, each of them with the same blue eyes, each of them looking at him. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, but he couldn't. Then in the blink of an eye, as if shot from a bow, the blue-eyed crows were flying at him, and he could do nothing to protect himself. And then he woke up. Bran told no one about the bad dream he had. It was not like he had anyone to tell. Besides, it was just a nightmare. It was not like he had not had those before. And there were only so many times you could call crying for your parents in the middle of the night before your father tells you that no matter how scary they might be, nightmares were just dreams, and he would need to learn to get over his fear of them on his own. The dream of the crows and the fist did not return to him the next couple of nights, so it seemed that no matter how much his own thoughts kept going back to it, it was not going to be some recurring vision he would have to face every time he slept. He thought Summer had been looking at him differently since that night, but if the direwolf knew something, he was not saying anything. He was drawn from his thoughts by Sir Robar heatedly saying something to a pair of knights. Bran was too far away to hear what was being said, but by the end Sir Robar stormed away from them and over to Bran. Sir Robar held out his shield, which Bran took. The knight was still scowling and must have noticed Bran's curious look. A knight is supposed to be honorable, Sir Robar said, but many of them often forget that. I want you to remember, Bran, that people can be cruel to each other, even someone whose duty is to defend the innocent and weak. Sir Robar was looking at someone, and Bran followed his gaze to see who at first he thought was a large man, only to realize it was in fact a woman. She was taller than many of the men around her, and broader of shoulder too. She was not what one would call a beauty, but Bran did see she had very blue eyes that reminded him of his mother's, eyes that were currently filled with tears. Who is that? What happened? That is Brienne of Tarth, only child of Lord Selwyn Tarth. What the gods did not grace her in beauty, they have graced her in strength and skill with sword. Because that is not the way of most women, many men seem fit to mock her. Some to her face, and many more behind her back. Bran felt sorry for Brian and wanted to go talk with her, but his duties as a squire found him needing to follow Sir Robar, who decided he was done training for the day. He found Brian again later at the dinner feast being held by the Tyrells, this their 6th night of being at Highgarden. The tourney was due to start in 2 more days, and more people packed the hall. Yet despite the tables becoming more and more crowded, Brian sat at the end of a long table, head downcast, as she ate alone. Bran slid into the seat across from her and she looked up at him in surprise. He had expected someone a bit older but found she was still a young face. He realized she could not have been much older than Robb and Jon, of age with Theon at the oldest. "Hi," Bran said. Brian looked around for a moment before turning back to him with guarded eyes. "Hi. My name is Bran Stark." Bran held out his hand, as he had seen his father do with the many lords and knights he had met over the years. "I'm a page for Sir Robar Royce." Brian grasped his hand and shook it. "I am Brian Tarth." Her hand all but swallowed his. Her palm and fingers were rough with callus. Bran marveled at the strength he felt in her grip before she released his hand. "My sister would love you," Bran said, thinking of Arya. Brian flinched at his words, as if struck. Bran realized she thought he was mocking her, like those knights had been doing earlier. He felt sad for her. "She would?" Brian asked, doubtfully. "Oh yes. She wants to be a warrior like Nymeria of the Rowan. She is a year older than me and she keeps stealing practice swords to practice on her own. And despite the fact she is not supposed to be using them, she is a better shot with a bow than me. Mother hates it and keeps trying to stop her, but I think father is secretly pleased because she reminds him of my aunt who passed away before I was born. My sister even named her direwolf Nymeria." Brian gave him a small, shy smile. "Am I to assume that the giant beast I saw in the Godswood is yours?" "His name's Summer. I can introduce you, if you would like to meet him." "I think I would like that. Do you want to meet him now? It's his dinner time too." Brian looked unsure, but after a look around, and seeing that no one was paying her any attention, she nodded and stood. Bran grabbed at the food on the table, picking pieces of each of the meats, duck, venison, and boar. He piled a plate high, knowing that the Tyrells put out so much food each night that a lot of it went to waste anyway and that Summer would eat it all without issue. "Come on." Bran led her out of Highgarden's great hall, through its various courtyards, and into its godswood. It was a path he knew well. They walked in silence, Brian slowing her pace so her long strides did not leave him behind. As soon as they entered the godswood, Summer was there, tongue lolling out of his mouth. Brian took a quick step back at his sudden appearance, hand reflexively going to her hip. Rather than go to Bran, who held all the food, Summer approached Brian and sat in front of her. He looked at her with his big golden eyes and softly whined. With slow movements, Brian reached out one of her giant hands and stroked the fur along Summer's neck. To Bran's surprise, Summer leaned into her touch. Summer enjoyed being pet by those brave enough to do so, but his direwolf had only acted like this with Bran and his siblings, never anyone outside of the family. It was then that Bran knew that while Margaery Tyrell might be the most beautiful to look upon, it was actually Brian of Tarth who was the most beautiful person in Highgarden. Chapter 16, Robb v. Robb v. The completion of the Wolf's Road took place without any issue. Robb, Jon, Theon, an escort of 30 men, 12 servants, 5 cooks, and 10 wagons filled with enough food, drink, and other supplies to satisfy a small army for at least one night, and enough coin to pay each of the workers their due, traveled for 5 days along the newly laid road. They came to a halt at a place in the road where there was a 10-foot gap that had yet to be laid with stone, roughly halfway between Winterfell and Deepwood Motte. 100 workers idled in the clearing that had been created around the gap, waiting for their liege lords to come to honor the completion of their months of labor. Robb had put the idle workers and servants to work, unloading tables and benches for men to sit at, and then setting the tables with utensils, plates, and cups, while the cooks built fire pits and began to cook the food. Lord Galbart Glover came shortly after with his own escort of men, including his brother Robert and his ward Lance Snow, the bastard son of Harley's Hornwood. Rob made a speech, one he had prepared days in advance, thanking the workers for all their hard work and rejoicing in the strengthening of the ties that connected House Glover and House Stark. The last of the stone was laid, accompanied by a loud cheer from the men. He then bade them all to eat and drink in celebration. The workers ate like starving men and drank such that each of them woke the next day with a pounding head. The next morning he distributed the pay to the workers, half of whom followed his party east along the Wolf's Road, while the rest followed Lord Glover west. For the first keep he had kept his promise of using only workers from the north to do the majority of the work. The stone and the stonemasons came from the mountain clans. The wood was purchased from the various lumber camps around Winterfell. Carpenters were brought in from as far north as Last Hearth to as far south as Barrowton. He hired weavers from White Harbour to make tapestries to adorn the walls, and looked to the Sheep's Head Hills for new bedding. The decision with the Lycoyard had been made after conversation with, of all people, old Nan. She told him stories of the curses placed on the Barrows in the Barrowlands, where the Barrow kings of old were buried. She told him stories of the ghosts of the kings of winter rising from the crypts when the swords were removed from their stone hands. She told him stories of the shades that haunted the cellars of the Dread Fort, unable to rest peacefully in the afterlife because of the horrors they endured in their final moments. And then she told him that servants of kings weren't important enough to curse their burial grounds, nor did they suffer such atrocities that they would seek vengeance. They lived plain lives and died plain deaths, and then they passed plainly on. He had the entire Lycoyard excavated. He was going to build a big pyre and burn any remains they found, but they didn't find any remains. They dug as deep as Hodder was tall, a full 7 feet, and they didn't even find a single bone. It was common knowledge that the cold helped preserve things, like dead bodies, and the thought was that the cold grounds of the north would have preserved at least some of the remains, but Master Lewin speculated that the hot springs that sat below Winterfell must have kept the ground warmer than they initially realized, and even the bones had decomposed after a few hundred years. The removed soil was put back where it belonged and grass seedlings were spread out over the entire area. He had stone paths put in place, connecting the first keep to the other passageways that led to the crypts and the rest of the castle. In the center of the now former Lycoyard he planted a willow sapling. In a few decades it would provide shade from the sun during the summer years and help protect from the harsh snows of winter. He envisioned 10 years from now placing a stone bench beneath its branches, and sitting there with his own son as he told him stories. The restoration of the first keep and the excavation of the Lycoyard had taken more of his money from the dowry than expected, and he found he had to dip into the Winterfell vaults to complete his expansion of the glass gardens, but thought the price well worth it. To make things easier for Mikken he had requested, and been granted, the use of the blacksmith of House Serrin, whose castle was a little over a full day's ride to the south. It was decided, after conversation with Maester Lewin, to make the glass gardens into an L shape, and have the new expansion run perpendicular to the current structure, along the western wall that surrounded the Godswood. They had to cut down a few of the sentinels and soldier pines that stood where they wanted to put the new expansion. There were glasscrafters in King's Landing, Dawn, and the Reach, but the glasscrafter they ended up hiring came from MYR, a process that was handled by Lord Marndaly, who had extensive dealings with the Free Cities. The expert glasscrafter who came, accompanied by servants, apprentices, and a large kill on wheels that was pulled by 2 burly oxen, didn't speak a word of the common tongue. They had much more success with the servants and apprentices, who spoke in heavy accents, half of them Mirish and the rest a mixture of the other Free Cities. The language of the glasscrafter, and the main language of everyone he brought with him, was bastard dialects of High Valyrian, a language Rob was not versed in. Surprisingly, Jon seemed to have a far better understanding of what the glasscrafter was saying than anyone else in Winterfell, including Maester Lewin, who had studied the language for several years at the Citadel. "I can't explain it," Jon said, when prodded about his understanding of High Valyrian, when the only other language they had been taught growing up was the old tongue of the First Men. "I did study it some from tomes in the library, but this is my first time hearing it spoken. Their words sound off, like they are speaking with a heavy accent compared to how I know the words should be spoken." Rob ended up hiring one of the elder apprentices, a male teenager from MYR with olive skin and dark hair who was 2 years younger than Rob himself, to be the glasscrafter of Winterfell. The lad would need to finish his apprenticeship, which was still about 2 to 3 years away, but when finished he would come back to Winterfell to live as their glasscrafter. Rob would provide him with the materials needed to complete the work, including a giant kiln, and allow him to make glass for anyone who came with coin, while getting a small cut of the profit. At least that was what the contract Rob had signed said. He paid a few gold coins from the Winterfell vaults to facilitate the agreement, and stored his copy of the contract in a trunk in the vault, to make sure nothing would happen for it before it came time for it to be fulfilled. The glass planes were crafted and carefully locked into place in the new frame. The section of the glass gardens that separated the old section from the new were removed, and the glass gardens were now almost double in size. With the completion of the renovations on the first keep and the expansion of the glass gardens, the tradesmen that had been occupying Winterfell for the past 5 months were gone, their work completed and Rob's dowry purse left empty. Yet the 2 projects he had set for himself, to build the strength of the Starks, like his father had been doing for the past 16 years, were done, and he felt himself swell with pride. Unfortunately, he didn't have any downtime because shortly after the last tradesman left, they had to start preparing for the harvest feast. A celebration he had extended into a 3-day affair, in order to hold the first Gearmana in the north in over 100 years. A Gearmana was the northern version of a tourney, though it was more appropriate to say the other way around since Gearmanas had existed since before the war. The events in the Gearmana were the hammer toss, caber throw, horse racing, tug of war, boulder carry, and melee. Each of the events had small prizes for the winners, with the melee having a purse of 300 dragons for the winner. The last time a Gearmana had been held was the infamous one held at Last Hearth over 100 years ago, where 18 participants died. The winnings weren't enough to draw anyone of note to participate, but to the small folk the winnings could change their lives for the better, and 300 dragons could be enough to last a man for the rest of his life if he was smart about it. Rob was hoping enough men would enter that he could find some hidden talent to offer a place in the House Guards. An area just outside Wintertown had been fenced in to hold the events, with stands going up to seat the few thousand spectators. The servants and guards from Winterfell would be allowed to watch from the walls. His mother, who had hosted multiple harvest feasts for the north, handled most of the heavy lifting in preparing Winterfell itself for the celebration, including the 3 dinners of the feast. She had arrived back from Riverrun 8 days prior, after the passing of her father. When the news had reached of Lord Hoster Tully passing, Rob had worn black for a week to mourn his grandfather, even if he had only met the man twice outside of the months following his birth, one of which he didn't even remember. In the preparation of the harvest feast, Winifred shadowed his mother's every move, so that whenever the responsibility for such things passed to her she would be ready. Some of the nobles had already started arriving. As his father had done in years past, Rob met with them each individually in an empty great hall with his mother and Winifred on one side, and Sir Roderick and Maester Lewin on the other. It was from here that he greeted each of the lords as they arrived at Winterfell, to hear the real reason they came all this way. Lady Maege Mormont had arrived with her eldest daughter Daisy and 30 men-at-arms 3 days before the feast. She noted that the wildlings were more active than ever, having dealt with a handful of raids within the last few months, and that she needed more ships to patrol the Bay of Ice. She also needed sailors and fighters to man those ships because Bear Island didn't have the population to. Lady Maege also hinted that she wanted to set up a betrothal between Bran and either Jarell or Lyanna, whichever of her 2 younger daughters the Starks would prefer. Lord Galbart Glover had marched with the Mormonts from Deepwood Motte. He had with him his brother Robert, his good sister Sybil Locke, and his 3-year-old nephew Goran, as well as 50 men-at-arms. With winter approaching, he wanted to increase the amount of game his hunters were able to kill to increase their stores. On top of that, Lord Galbart believed there was illegal logging taking place within the Wolfswood and asked that Winterfell provide more patrols. He also discussed the possibility of fostering his nephew at Winterfell in a few years, since Goran was close in age with Rickon and was likely to be named Galbart's heir. The day after the Mormonts and Glovers arrived saw the arrival of Lord Wyman Marndaly. He came with his son and Rob's good father Sir Willis, his other son Sir Wendell, Willis's wife and Rob's good mother Leona Woolfield, several of his pledged lords like Lord Andrew Locke of Oldcastle, 200 knights and men-at-arms, a troupe of musicians, and even a juggler. Lord Marndaly wondered about giving the White Tower, the abandoned keep that sat a few days north of White Harbour along the western banks of the White Knife, to his son Wendell, since its lands and people already belonged to House Marndaly. Lord Wyman also thought, since Lord Eddard Stark was the hand of the king, that he should be able to start minting silver. That would greatly increase the wealth of the North and, more specifically, House Marndale. Lord Hornwood arrived the following day, one day before the feast, with his wife Donella Marndale, his son Darin, and 20 men at arms. His concern was that he believed there was an aggressive wolf pack roaming his lands because his small folk kept turning up dead with most of their flesh missing from their bodies, as if torn at by a pack of hungry animals. He wanted hunters and trackers from Winterfell to join his men in hunting down this wolf pack. Hours after the Hornwoods arrived, Lord Major Sewin came with his 2 children, his daughter Jonelle and his son Clee, and 15 lancers. Lord Sewin didn't have to travel a far distance to attend the feast, so there was no other reason for his coming besides being so close. Although he broached the subject about betrothing Arya to his son and heir, he was disappointed to hear that there was already a promise with King Robert for her betrothal to Prince Tommen. Some of the requests Robb was able to grant. He would send Winterfell's best hounds and trackers back with Lord Hornwood to assist in hunting down the wolf pack. He would ask Horlis to send groups of guards to search the Wolfswood from the coasts and back, to see what they found. Others, like providing the Mormonts with more longships, allowing the Marndales to mint silver, and increasing the amount of game hunted for the Glovers, he felt he would need to speak with his father about because Eddard Stark was still their lord. Robb awoke the day of the feast itself with a grin on his face. There were 2 more nobles coming with their families and they were both expected to arrive today. The first were the Umbers of Last Hearth, and the second were his foster family, the Karstarks of Karhold. It had been a year since he had last seen any of the Karstarks, as none had made the trip for his wedding, so it would be good to see them again. He noticed the bed next to him was empty. Winifred had come down with a sickness yesterday morning, but had recovered in time to join him in greeting the lords. It looked like whatever had ailed her persisted another day. Getting ready for the day, Robb moved to Theon's room, which was located close to his own. Today was not just the day of the harvest feast, it was also Theon's name-a-day. He knocked on the door and after a moment it was opened by Theon, who looked a little out of it. No doubt he had spent the night in Wintertown at one of the brothels in celebration. "It's early," Theon groused upon seeing Robb's grinning face. "I have something for you," Robb said, holding out a cloth-wrapped item. "Careful with it, it's sharp." Theon took the item from him and looked it over. He unwrapped the cloth and found himself looking at an axe. It was a one-handed axe with a curved blade on one end of the steel head, and a sharp point on the other. Carved into the head were 2 images, a kraken on one side and a direwolf on the other. The handle was wrapped in black leather with a leather strap on the bottom. "It's a battle axe used by Ironborn Reavers," Robb explained. "It's gorgeous," Theon murmured while examining it. "Some of Mickken's best work." Theon had some experience wielding a one-handed axe, as it was a weapon Sir Roderick had insisted on some training in. The old master-at-arms often said that in the heat of battle, sometimes your weapon gets knocked out of your hand and you don't always have the time to get it back or find a similar one. So you had to make do by grabbing the closest weapon to you. Sir Roderick made sure that they knew how to hold a multitude of weapons, as well as the basics on how to properly attack and defend with it. They were also taught how to grapple and wrestle, should they find themselves completely devoid of weapons. Robb cleared his throat. "I know it must have been hard, Jon and I leaving for 5 years to foster and leaving you here. I just wanted to let you know that even though I was gone for 5 years, I still consider you like a brother to me. That's why both the Greyjoy Kraken and the Stark Direwolf are carved into the head. Because you're as much a Stark as you are a Greyjoy." Theon looked at him with an expression Robb had never seen him wear before. Unless it was a witty joke, Theon wasn't the best with words, so instead he pulled Robb into a tight hug to show how much the gift meant to him. "Thank you." "You're welcome, but we should probably end the hug before." "Does Winifred know about this?" a teasing voice asked. "Before Jon found out." The Umber progression entered the yard shortly after breakfast, led by Jon Umber himself. The towering man was accompanied by his sons Jon and Hoarfrost, his youngest daughter Elna, his brother Rakar, and 40 men at arms. Everyone in the family was tall, as even Elna, who was 2 years younger than Robb, was of height with him. The large stature was the reason for Jon Umber being known as Great Jon. Robb walked into the great hall to see that only Sir Roderick sat on the dais that overlooked the hall. Turning to the guards by the door, Robb saw that Horlis was one of them. "Where are the others?" Robb asked, worry creeping into his voice. They are in Maester Lewin's rooms, Hollis answered. Lady Caitlin told me it is not urgent, and to continue with the greetings. Whatever sickness Winifred was dealing with must still be lingering. Why his mother was with her and Maester Lewin he was unsure, but he dismissed the thoughts from his mind. If they said it was not urgent, he would take them at their word and greet the Great Yon. Hollis, send for John and Theon and have them join me here before the Great Yon does. Hollis quickly left the room. No doubt John was out there in the yard greeting his former foster family, and he had to imagine Theon would be nearby as well. They both entered the hall with Hollis in tow. He gestured to the seats to his right, where Winifred and his mother had been sitting the previous few days. I find myself in need of advisors for today, Rob said. They took the seats, John the one next to Rob and Theon the one over. Rob gave the okay to Hollis, and in a few moments the Great Yon strode into the hall, his son and heir, known as Small John, following him. Despite being an accomplished swordsman himself, Ned Stark often proclaimed Great Yon the best fighter in the North, not that the North regularly had tourneys and melees like the South for the men to lock swords and show their skills. The Great Yon's size alone gave him a great advantage, as Rob thought there could only be a few men in all the realm who could surpass the man in size. Even the man's own son, who was a giant of a man himself, stopped a few inches short of his father. Little Rob, all grown up. Ha! Great Yon boomed as he came to a stop before them. Lord Umber, Winterfell bids you welcome. Bah, pleasantries are for old maids and southern lords. You're the Stark in Winterfell. I am. The wall is a fucking sieve. The amount of wildlings that have been invading my lands is the worst I've seen in all my years. Worst my uncles have seen too. Lady Mormont said the same, Rob admitted. Something needs to be done. As the Stark in Winterfell, your duty is to defend the North. Have you spoken with Lord Commander Mormont? Sir Roderick asked. Is there nothing the Night's Watch can do? The old bear can't do anything. The Night's Watch is a shell of itself. They don't have the manpower to patrol the wall in full, and some wildlings have the balls to climb the fucking thing. Great Yon speaks truly, John said. I saw for myself the state of the Night's Watch. Can't exactly force people to commit crimes, Theon said in an almost mocking tone. Great Yon glared at Theon, cowering the Greyjoy heir into silence. The Starks and Umbers have led armies beyond the wall before, to bloody the wildlings when they get too bold. I think it's time we do so again. Rob furrowed his brows as he contemplated the idea. He did recall such tales from his history lessons with Maester Lewin. They probably wouldn't even need that many men to impose their will on the wildlings, 10,000 would likely be more than enough. Still, marching men north and killing thousands of wildlings seemed like it should be a last resort. Leading men into battle is a serious thing, and one we should hold off on while other options remain to us. I know my father has sent men and supplies to the wall in his duties as hand, and I will do what I can as well. I shall let it be known that 25 silver stags will be given to the family of any man who joins the watch. Great Yon didn't look thrilled that his proposal to march a force beyond the wall to deal with the wildlings was being put to the wayside. Greybeards and cripples, that's what you send the watch. The Great Yon left in a huff. Rather than follow his father, Small John took a step toward the table and looked at John before looking at Rob. Did your brother ever tell you what we called him at last hearth? Small John asked with a grin. John made a sound of distress. He didn't say anything to me, Rob answered. Theon. No, he did not, Theon said, leaning forward eagerly. No doubt he was thinking of the teasing they had received from John earlier after he had walked in on them hugging. Please don't, John murmured, his cheeks turning red. Smallest John, Small John said before cackling with laughter. Rob and Theon shared a look before bursting into laughter themselves. Even Sir Roderick couldn't help but guffaw. John sank lower in his chair. Is mocking me the only reason you joined your father in here? John asked. Of course it was. I'll see you at the feast, Lord Rob, Smallest John. Small John bowed his head and left the great hall. 20 minutes later, when it was announced that Lord Karstark had arrived, Theon was still quietly chuckling to himself. While Rob stayed in the great keep to welcome his foster father and hear whatever concerns he wished to bring to him, Hollis relayed the information of the new arrivals. Rickard Karstark had brought all 3 of his sons, Haryon, Torren, and Eddard, his daughter Alis, and 30 men at arms. Lord Ricard Karstark was escorted into the great hall by one of the guards. He was gaunt and tall, with a thick grey beard and hair loose past his shoulders. Robb knew the man to be stern and vengeful, and had a love for his children that outweighed everything else. "Lord Karstark, it warms my heart to see you again," Robb greeted. "Aye lad, it is good to see you too. It seems like just yesterday you were sparring with my sons in the yards at Carhold, and yet a year has passed since those days." "Great days they were," Robb said with a smile. "Know that Winterfell is open to you and yours in your time here." "Thank you, foster son, but I have come for more than just the hospitality of your halls. Carhold is a strong castle and its people stronger, but our economy is isolated and winters have always been rough on us. I want to build a trading port at the mouth of the Grey. I want to build ships to trade with White Harbor, Gulltown, King's Landing, even Braavos." The Grey was a small river, more of a big stream really, that flowed below the walls of Carhold and emptied out into the shivering sea. Like most of the north, the Karstarks' main sources of trade would be wood and furs, but they were so far north and so far from the King's Road, that few traders actually made their way there, even with the new road being built between it and Last Hearth. If they wanted any hope of increasing trade, it would have to be through a port. He just wondered how this would affect the relationship with the Mandaealis. White Harbor was the central trading hub of the north because of its ports. In fact, Robb couldn't recall if any of his other vassals had anything besides some fishing piers. That gave House Mandaealy a lot of power and a lot of wealth. He would ask Winifred how she thought her father would greet this news. "A great and worthy goal to better your house," Robb stated. There had to be more to this. What Ricard Karstark wanted to do, he didn't need to discuss with Robb. "Thank you. It's just," Lord Karstark hesitated, "building a port requires a lot of money, and House Karstark has never been a house rich in coin." There it was. He needed money to build the piers, warehouses, and ships, and before he went seeking a potential loan from someone, he came to see if his liege lord would instead provide it to him. Robb wondered if Ricard would make such a request if it was his father sitting where he now sat. Perhaps the thought was that someone who had lived with his family for 5 years would be more open to providing the funding. "How much does House Karstark need?" Sir Roderick asked, leaning forward. "About 4,000 in gold." Robb's eyebrows shot up in surprise for a second before he got his face under control. Sir Roderick tugged at his whiskers, Jon sat still with a stoic face, and Theon let out a small whistle. They could pay that and still have plenty left in the vaults. His father had spent a lot of money on building roads and keeps throughout the north, and Robb had dipped into the coffers himself for things, but there was still more than enough in there. A request that large would be expected to be paid back in time. If there was an increase in trade at Carhold, that meant more taxes that would be collected. Over time, lending the money to Lord Karstark would be paid back and then some, but for that amount of money it would take years. Maybe he could lend it with an agreement of doubling the tax rate the first 7 years as a way to pay it back quicker, or something similar. He wondered, given the large amount being requested, if it was a topic best sent to his father to deal with. "That is a large sum," Robb said, stating the obvious. "I can make no guarantees at this time, but we'll see what we can do before you leave for home." I understand. I will see you at the feast. Tell your children I will stop by to see them shortly. It will be good to see them all again." As soon as Lord Karstark left the room, Winifred came in with his mother behind her. His wife looked a little tired but otherwise fine. She had a nervous energy about her, her hands fidgeting with the cloth of her sleeves. His mother had the biggest smile Robb could ever remember seeing, and not even the sight of Jon sitting at his side could dampen it. 4,000 gold is a lot of money, Jon muttered. "It's a big ask of Lord Karstark," Sir Roderick agreed. "My lord husband," Winifred said as she came to a stop in front of him, interrupting their discussion. Robb stood up, moving around the table and stepping down from the dais to stand before his wife. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "Are you all right? Has yesterday's sickness lingered?" Winifred gave a shy look over his shoulder, at the three who still sat on the dais, before her eyes came back to rest on his. "I'm more than all right. I'm pregnant." Chapter 17, Jon V. Jon V. Training the 7 worst recruits of the Stark House Guard was a difficult task, but for Jon it was still easier than trying to train a single Samwell Tarly. Each of the men had their own flaws to overcome, but at least none of them were openly craven or traumatized by a life of abuse that made them shy from the very idea of conflict. John knew early on that to make them into true guards, he would need to see them as more than just 7 unremarkable names on a list. They had to become men with strengths, weaknesses, and stories of their own. On his first day as their trainer, John faced an uphill battle. All 7 recruits were older than he was, most by several years, and they looked at him with the kind of skepticism he had faced all of his life. Respect would not come with his name, only with his steel. So he challenged each of them, one by one, in the training yard. He beat them soundly. Then he let them come at him 2 at a time. Then 3. Eventually, all 7. Still, none could so much as land a solid blow. Bruised, panting, and sore, the 7 recruits looked on in shock as Jon Snow stood before them, untouched and calm. That was the moment they began to listen. The next day, training truly began. Gannon was built like a wall, tall, thick-necked, with arms that could snap logs, but his mind was slow and easily lost. Rylar had a mane of red hair and the sharp tongue of someone who thought too highly of himself. Aston, barely Arya's height, carried his smallness like a wound and flinched at the snap of a raised voice. Barrett and Karim were brothers, who had both inherited uncoordinated limbs. Kennett was lanky and unsure, always watching others before daring to act. And Oliver. Oliver thought he knew best, always. On everything. Not all of them were meant to be swordsmen. Jon saw that quickly. Though Sir Roderick handled the broader training of the castle's recruits, Jon was free to shape his 7 however he saw fit. Though there were spearmen and bowmen in their numbers, Lord Stark favored the sword and shield for his house guard. Jon decided to experiment. He had each man try different weapons for a week at a time, watching carefully for the smallest sign of aptitude. He altered his training to suit their needs, repeating things slowly and often for Gannon, humbling Rylar while still stroking his pride, and coaxing courage from Aston with patience and encouragement. After 6 long months, Jon stood in the yard and watched as men who had once been laughingstocks now moved with purpose and skill. Barrett and Karim were made bowmen, where the repetitive nature of drawing a bow became muscle memory, and after time even their clumsy hands could do the actions without messing it up. Kennett was given a spear to add to his already impressive reach, and joined the small ranks of spearmen that made up the guard. Gannon was given a warhammer, the only member of the guard to wield one, a simple swing and smash weapon that wouldn't require much thought from him to use effectively. Oliver, Rylar, and Aston, after each of them overcame their flaws that held them back, became capable swordsmen. They joined the house guard proper, shortly after the rest of the recruits under Sir Roderick did. The old Master-at-Arms had been impressed at their progress, and told Jon that he could have a future as the Master-at-Arms of any castle, including Winterfell, if he wanted. Jon added it to the list of options available to him for his future. The training ended just in time to welcome the various noble families of the north that came to Winterfell as the harvest feast approached. Even if the guard wasn't at full strength, it was nice to have more capable men around the castle to remind their vassals of the strength of House Stark. Robb declared that those who stayed at Winterfell would be split between the first keep and the guest hall, which Jon believed was another reminder of the size and power of House Stark and their ancestral seat. Because of his status, Jon wasn't in the yard greeting most of the guests, but he was there when the Umbers came, to greet his former foster family. They were just as Jon remembered them, loud and direct. He only had a few moments to welcome them to Winterfell before he was summoned to join Robb in the Great Hall. And then Winifred had told Robb she was 3 months pregnant. Jon couldn't believe it. Robb was going to be a father and he was going to be an uncle. Robb shared the news that night at the harvest feast, eliciting a mighty cry from all in attendance and sending the celebration into an even bawdier affair. Lord Marndaly was beside himself with joy and Sir Willis was so happy he shed tears. Even Jon's former foster father, Great Jon Umber, had quickly gotten over his earlier sullenness at Robb not agreeing with his plan to march beyond the wall and joined in on the cheer. Jon had quickly found himself surrounded by the 3 Umber men, Great Jon, Small Jon, and Hoarfrost, and was forced to drink cup after cup of ale in celebration of his coming niece or nephew. He had not drank that much since the first night King Robert had come to Winterfell all those months ago, though it had been wine he had consumed in excess that night, and the morning after was just as wretched as it was then. After getting over a hangover that none of the 3 Umber men suffered from, Despite them all out drinking him, he found himself outside the walls of Winterfell in the stands, watching the melee that Robb had ordered to take place the following day. The other events of the Gearmana would take place the following day. The rest of the Starks, as well as all of the nobles and their families, sat in a viewing booth separate from everyone else. Jon sat with the small folk from Wintertown and the surrounding areas who had come to witness the event. The purse was modest, so no knights of high name had entered. A few hedge knights came with Lord Marndale, and around 50 men-at-arms from visiting households joined the fray. 20-some hopefuls from Wintertown and beyond also took the field. They were dressed in worn leathers and rusted chain, likely relics from Robert's rebellion. Robb had tasked Jon with scouting potential recruits from among the commoners, hoping to swell the numbers of the House Guard, still recovering from the loss of men after Lord Eddard's departure to King's Landing. Lady Catelyn's return from Riverrun brought that number up to 127, but that was still well short of the 200 it once boasted before their father had departed to King's Landing with half its number. The small folk who watched the melee loved the entire thing. They weren't of the south, where seeing 100 knights go at each other could be a yearly occurrence. This was the first melee held in the north in 100 years, and even if the level of competition wasn't the highest, it was still entertaining. They were going to be even more fond of the food that would be provided to them after the melee, while the nobles and their men crowded back into Winterfell to feast. Do any of them look promising to you? Jon turned to see Sir Roderick had made his way to join him in the stands. Jon looked back to the melee, where a burly hedge knight who had come with Lord Marndale knocked down one of the Umber men-at-arms. Sir Roderick was also observing to see who would be a fine addition to the House Guard. The older ones certainly have skill. They are veterans of the rebellion, aren't they? Most likely, Sir Roderick agreed. Men in their mid to late 30s might seem too old to join the House Guard at other times, but when able men were in short supply, Jon didn't see why not. Some of the current guards lived in Wintertown with their families, and if these older men, 5 of them in total, had their own families, they could always have them moved into Wintertown as well. There was a great clash of metal as one of the men-at-arms tripped over something and fell, shield first, into a knight. They both toppled to the ground, earning a laugh from all those who watched, as both men found themselves eliminated. Another handful of fighters were knocked out, including the last of the commoners. There were plenty wounded, but no one had been killed yet, which Jon considered a good thing even if some in the stands might not agree. The crowd roared as each man fell. Only a quarter of the fighters remained, all of them knights or men-at-arms. With none of the small folk remaining, neither Jon nor Sir Roderick needed to continue to watch the melee, but he had to admit it was entertaining to see. The burly hedge knight ended up winning the entire thing. The man was certainly skilled, though how skilled was difficult to say given his level of competition. Jon wondered if Jory, the best swordsman out of Winterfell's guard, would have won the competition if he was not at King's Landing. Still, it was a shame the hedge knight was committed to Lord Marndale. House Stark could use a man like that. Before the feast that night, Robb had Sir Roderick and Jon join him in the Lord's Solar. Ghost sat at Jon's feet, while Grey Wind sat at Robb's. What are your thoughts on the small folk in the melee? Do any of them have any skill? Robb asked. The older ones do, Sir Roderick said. Likely veterans who fought against the Targaryens and then the Greyjoys. The bearded one with the axe, Jon added, remember the man who had knocked out one of the Mormony men-at-arms. Though my recommendation is to offer a spot to all of them. All of them? Robb asked in surprise. While only some of them have skill, to even enter the melee takes some bravery and boldness. And let's be honest, we need the numbers. Sir Roderick grunted in agreement and tugged at his whiskers, as he often did. While training so many raw recruits at once is burdensome, Jon's help will make things easier. Robb looked thoughtful. What about this Syrio Forel that Arya trains with? Can he help with training? It was a surprise to them all when this slight, bald man with a beak of a nose returned from Riverrun with Lady Catelyn, Arya, and Rickon. Syrio spoke with a Braavosi accent and claimed to once have been the first sword of the Sea Lord of Braavos, a position he had held for 9 years. It seemed their father had been persuaded by Jon's letter to let Arya train with her sword, and had decided to hire Arya her own personal trainer. A Bravo trainer for a Bravo sword, Arya said their father had told her when he had introduced the man to her. Whatever issues she had with the situation, Lady Caitlin must have learned to accept it, as she rarely voiced her displeasure with the entire situation. Rob had spoken with his mother about it, and she had told him it was a decision made by their father, sparing John of any repercussions for his role. She still frowned and muttered things to herself under her breath, but while she was not actively supportive of Arya's sword lessons, she was pleased that there were no longer any issues getting Arya to attend any of her other lessons. It seemed that Arya was sticking to her promise of attending lessons with Maester Luwin and Septa Mordane. Like Jorel Mormont, Arya's afternoon lessons with the Septa were shortened to allow for weapons training. Though unlike Jorella, Arya did not join them in the yard. Syrio had his own way of teaching, and it was beyond odd. Jon had come upon Arya standing on one leg on an upside-down bucket in the middle of a courtyard.